The ICU corridor at Northridge Military Medical Center fell deadly silent the moment four-star General Marcus Blackwood's fist cracked against the reinforced observation glass. His daughter, blind since birth, had just released a scream so raw it froze every nurse mid-step. Inside room 7, a rookie nurse in wrinkled scrubs stood paralyzed, gripping a tiny ophthalmoscope like smoking gun evidence. 23-year-old Tessa Morgan had been invisible for 6 weeks, dismissed as barely competent help. Now she stood center stage, her voice cutting through chaos. "General, I found something in your daughter's eyes." The chief ophthalmologist laughed, until General Blackwood spoke 3 words that drained color from every face in that hallway. "If you want to see how far justice can reach when one person refuses to stay silent, stay with me until the very end of this story. And please, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels." Morgan sat in her decade-old sedan, engine throbbed. Ready to take on the day, Morgan sat in her decade-old sedan, engine idling, staring at the fortress of glass and steel that had become her personal battlefield. 6 weeks into her nursing contract, and she'd already learned the most important survival rule: be invisible. She grabbed her thermos, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, dark circles under green eyes, hair pulled back too tight, and pushed open the car door into the downpour. The rain soaked through her scrubs before she reached the employee entrance, where her badge barely registered on the 3rd swipe. The security guard didn't look up. Inside, the night shift hummed with controlled chaos. Tessa moved through the maze of corridors with practiced efficiency, nodding to colleagues who rarely nodded back. She'd stopped trying to join conversations in the break room after the 2nd week, when senior nurse Patricia Hendricks had literally turned her back mid-sentence to answer a question Tessa hadn't asked. "Morgan." The voice came from behind the nurse's station, sharp, administrative, designed to remind her of exactly where she ranked. Charge nurse Diane Sutton stood with a clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "You're covering ICU tonight, room 7, General Blackwood's daughter." Tessa's stomach dropped. She'd heard the whispers about room 7, about the 4-star general whose only child had been born without sight, about the parade of specialists who'd examined her over 18 years and found nothing fixable. It was the kind of assignment given to nurses who couldn't make waves, observation duty dressed up as patient care. "Comfort measures only," Sutton continued, her tone suggesting Tessa might not grasp the concept. "The family doesn't want false hope. The girl's condition is permanent. Just monitor vitals, document everything, and stay out of the way when the real medical team comes through." The real medical team. Tessa swallowed the familiar sting. "Understood," she said quietly. Sutton's eyes narrowed. "Dr. Victor Crane is the chief ophthalmologist on this case. He's been working with Miss Blackwood since she was 3 years old. You follow his protocols exactly. No improvising, no suggestions. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear." "Good." Sutton handed over the chart like she was relieving herself of contaminated material. "The general's in D.C. this week, but his wife visits every evening. Professional distance, Morgan. This family has enough stress." Tessa took the chart and headed toward the ICU, her wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor. She'd worked in 3 hospitals before Northridge, smaller places where nurses' observations actually mattered, where questions were welcomed instead of weaponized. But Northridge was different. This was where military elite sent their families, where reputations were built on prestigious cases and crushed by any hint of incompetence. She was still invisible here, and maybe that was safer. Room 7 sat at the end of the ICU corridor, separated from the chaos by reinforced glass and the weight of 18 years' worth of medical records. Tessa paused outside, studying the figure visible through the window. Avery Blackwood sat upright in bed, her posture military straight despite the hospital gown. 18 years old, according to the chart. Dark hair, delicate features, and eyes that stared forward without focus, clouded, milky, seeing nothing. Tessa knocked softly and entered. "Hello, Miss Blackwood. I'm Tessa. I'll be your nurse tonight." Avery's head turned toward her voice with practiced precision. "You can call me Avery, and you sound nervous." The observation caught Tessa off guard. "I'm sorry?" "You're breathing. It's shallow, fast. Avery's expression remained neutral, but something flickered there. Amusement, maybe, or pity. Let me guess. They told you I'm the general's daughter, so now you're terrified you'll screw something up and end up reassigned to bedpan duty in the basement. Despite everything, Tessa smiled. Something like that. Relax. I'm not going to report you for being human. Avery shifted against her pillows, fingers finding the water cup on her bedside table with the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of adaptation. Besides, you're the third new nurse this month. I'm starting to think they use this room for training exercises. Tessa moved closer, checking the monitors with hands that had finally stopped shaking. How are you feeling tonight? Like I always feel, functional, frustrated, waiting for my mother to show up and pretend everything's fine, while silently cataloging all the ways my existence disappoints her. The bitterness in Avery's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. I'm sure that's not... Don't! Avery cut her off cleanly. I don't need polite lies from strangers. My father's a 4-star general. My mother teaches military strategy at the War College. I was supposed to continue the legacy. Instead, I got born broken, and they've spent 18 years parading me in front of specialists looking for someone to fix their mistake. Tessa said nothing. Sometimes silence was the most honest response. Sorry. Avery's shoulders dropped slightly. That was unfair. You seem nice. I'm just tired of being a problem that can't be solved. Tessa finished her initial assessment, noting vitals that were completely normal, except for the elevated heart rate that came from chronic stress. She should have left it there. Should have documented everything and faded back into her comfortable invisibility. But something in Avery's voice, that bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd stopped hoping, made her pause. Would you mind if I took a quick look at your eyes? The words escaped before Tessa's better judgment could stop them. Just for my own understanding, Avery's expression shifted toward suspicion. They've been examined by every ophthalmologist between here and Johns Hopkins. Trust me, there's nothing new to find. I know, I'd like to see for myself, if that's okay. For a long moment, Avery didn't respond. Then she shrugged. Knock yourself out, can't make anything worse. Tessa retrieved the ophthalmoscope from the equipment cart, her hand steady despite the voice in her head screaming that this was exactly the kind of overstep that got probationary nurses fired. She'd watched her mother use this tool 1,000 times in their small-town clinic, back before medical school debt and divorce had shattered that world into pieces. Back when healing seemed simple. She dimmed the room lights and moved close, the ophthalmoscope's beam cutting through darkness. Look straight ahead for me. Avery complied, her clouded eyes reflecting the light like foggy windows. Tessa adjusted the focus, moving closer, examining the structures visible through the haze. The cornea appeared intact. The anterior chamber seemed normal. But there, just behind the iris, barely visible through the cloudiness, she saw it. A membrane. Thin, translucent, stretched across the lens like a veil. Tessa's breath caught. She pulled back, double-checked the angle, looked again. The membrane was there in both eyes, subtle enough to miss in a standard examination, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. She'd seen this exactly once before, in a patient her mother had treated when Tessa was 12 years old. A congenital cataract variant so rare most doctors never encountered it, but fixable, surgically removable. What? Avery's voice had gone sharp. What did you see? Tessa's mind raced. Protocol said she should document this and alert the attending physician. But protocol also said a probationary nurse didn't contradict 18 years of specialist opinions. Protocol said stay invisible. I need to check something in your chart, Tessa said carefully, moving to the computer terminal. She pulled up Avery's complete medical history, scrolling through examination notes that dated back to infancy. The early assessments mentioned bilateral opacity and clouding of uncertain origin. But somewhere around age 7, the notes shifted. Dr. Victor Crane had taken over the case, and his evaluations grew increasingly definitive. Congenital blindness, no surgical options, condition permanent. No mention of membranes, no discussion of removable obstructions, just certainty, absolute career-defining certainty. Tessa felt ice spread through her chest. Tessa? Avery had sat forward, her blind eyes somehow boring straight into Tessa's conscience. What did you find? The truth would detonate everything. It would challenge the chief ophthalmologist. It would question 18 years of treatment. It would make Tessa a target for every doctor and administrator who'd built their reputation on this case. It would also give Avery a chance. I think... Tessa's voice cracked. She cleared her throat, steadied herself. I think there might be something they missed. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse the room. Missed? Avery's hands gripped the bedsheet. What do you mean, missed? There's a membrane, a thin layer of tissue covering your lenses. It's congenital, extremely rare, but it's not permanent. It's removable. Avery's face had gone absolutely white. You're saying I could see. I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying someone should look closer. Then why? Avery's voice broke. Why hasn't anyone said anything in 18 years? That was the question that would destroy careers. Before Tessa could answer, the door swung open. Dr. Victor Crane entered with the commanding presence of a man who'd never been challenged, flanked by two residents who looked at Tessa like she was a stain on the linoleum. Crane was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of distinguished features that photographed well for hospital brochures. His eyes landed on Tessa, then flicked to the ophthalmoscope still in her hand. Nurse Morgan. His tone could have frozen helium. May I ask what you're doing? Tessa straightened, fighting the instinct to apologize. I was performing a routine eye examination, doctor. Routine. Crane repeated the word like it tasted rotten. You're aware that Miss Blackwood's ocular condition has been extensively documented by specialists far more qualified than a probationary nurse with 6 weeks' experience? The resident smirked. Avery had gone rigid in bed, her hands clenched into fists. I am aware, doctor, but I noticed something in my examination that I thought should be brought to your attention. Crane's expression shifted from dismissive to dangerous. Did you? There appears to be a bilateral membrane obstruction that... Stop! Crane held up one hand, his voice dropping to the quiet register of absolute authority. Let me be very clear, Miss Morgan. You are not a diagnostician. You are not an ophthalmologist. You are a nurse, barely, whose job is to monitor vitals and provide comfort care, nothing more. But if there's even a chance, there is no chance. Crane stepped closer, his voice pitched low enough that the residents had to strain to hear. I have examined Miss Blackwood personally over 100 times. I have consulted with the finest ophthalmologists in 3 countries. Her condition is permanent, and your untrained speculation is not just wrong. It's cruel. Do you understand what false hope does to families like the Blackwoods? Tessa felt the familiar weight pressing down on her, the pressure to submit, to apologize, to disappear. She'd felt it every time a senior nurse dismissed her observation, every time a doctor talked over her in rounds, every time her suggestions were credited to someone else. But Avery was sitting right there, blind and desperate and deserving better than this. With respect, doctor, I think a second opinion. Enough! Crane's voice cracked like a whip. You will document standard observations and nothing else. You will not discuss your theories with the patient or her family. And if I hear that you've continued this reckless behavior, I will personally see to it that your contract is terminated. Am I clear? The residents watched with barely concealed satisfaction. This was how the hierarchy maintained itself, public humiliation as deterrent. Yes, doctor. Tessa forced the words out. Good. Now leave us. I need to examine my patient without further interference. Tessa moved toward the door, her face burning. But as she passed Avery's bed, she caught the girl's expression. Not grateful for the doctor's intervention, but furious. Avery's jaw was locked tight, her blind eyes fixed on some middle distance, her entire body radiating suppressed rage. Tessa left the room and stood in the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the glass, she watched Crane perform his examination with confident efficiency, his residents nodding along to his commentary. Everything by the book. Everything perfectly calibrated to maintain the status quo. Everything wrong. The shift dragged on with crushing weight. Tessa completed her rounds in mechanical silence, documenting vitals and medication administration without speaking unless spoken to. Patricia Hendricks made a pointed comment about knowing your place, that drew chuckles from the other senior nurses. Diane Sutton pulled her aside during break to reiterate the importance of staying in your lane. By 3 in the morning, Tessa found herself alone in the supply closet, ostensibly restocking IV bags, but really just hiding from the judgment that followed her through every corridor. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother, sent hours ago and just now noticed. "How's the new job, honey?" "Making friends." Tessa almost laughed. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "Still adjusting." The closet door opened. Tessa turned, expecting another lecture, but found Avery's mother instead. Elizabeth Blackwood was exactly what Tessa had imagined, perfectly composed, sharply dressed even at this hour, with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're Tessa Morgan." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Crane called me. He's concerned about your interaction with my daughter." Of course he had. Tessa set down the IV bags carefully. "I apologize if I overstepped, Mrs. Blackwood. That wasn't my intention." Elizabeth studied her with the intensity of someone trained to identify weaknesses. "He said you suggested Avery's blindness might be treatable. I observed a membrane structure that warranted further investigation. After 18 years and dozens of specialists found nothing." "Yes, ma'am. Do you understand how many times my daughter has been given hope, only to have it taken away?" Elizabeth's voice remained controlled, but something raw crept in beneath the polish. "Do you know what that does to a person?" Tessa met her eyes. "Do you know what giving up does?" The silence stretched between them like a tripwire. "Dr. Crane is the foremost ophthalmologist in military medicine," Elizabeth said finally. "His reputation is beyond reproach." "I'm sure it is. If there was something to find, he would have found it." "Maybe," Tessa took a breath. "Or maybe he missed it. Maybe everyone missed it because they were looking at what they expected to see instead of what was actually there." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "You're accusing him of malpractice." "I'm suggesting someone take another look. Someone without 18 years of investment in being right." The words hung in the air like dropped grenades. Tessa waited for the explosion, the formal complaint, the termination, the end of her career before it properly started. But Elizabeth just stared at her, something unreadable flickering behind those steel-gray eyes. "My husband returns from D.C. tomorrow evening," Elizabeth said quietly. "He'll want to hear about this directly." Tessa's stomach dropped. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause problems for—" "You already have." Elizabeth turned toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Morgan, Avery spoke to me after Dr. Crane left. She said you were the first person in years who looked at her like she was someone worth saving." The supply closet door clicked shut, leaving Tessa alone with the weight of what she'd set in motion. The next day passed in excruciating slow motion. Tessa worked her shift under constant surveillance, every movement tracked by senior staff who'd clearly been briefed on her transgression. She wasn't called to room 7. A different nurse covered Avery's care, shooting Tessa sympathetic glances that felt worse than outright hostility. Dr. Crane held morning rounds in the ICU corridor, his teaching session clearly staged for Tessa's benefit. He discussed a case study on the dangers of inexperienced staff making diagnostic assessments beyond their scope of practice, never mentioning names but making eye contact with Tessa every 30 seconds. By noon, Tessa had been summoned to a protocol review meeting scheduled for the following day. Administrator speak for a professional execution. Diane Sutton delivered the news with something almost like regret. "You could have had a good career here," Sutton said quietly, "if you'd just learned when to keep quiet." Tessa spent her afternoon break in her car, rain hammering the windshield while she updated her resume and wondered which hospital would even consider hiring her after Northridge blackballed her. She'd seen it happen before. A nurse who questioned a doctor's judgment, who pushed too hard for a patient, who forgot that medicine was as much about politics as healing. She was invisible again. But this time, it felt like erasure. Evening came with the inevitability of execution dawn. Tessa clocked in for what might be her last shift, nodding to colleagues who'd already stopped seeing her. She was restocking medication carts when the ICU erupted. The first sign was the commotion at the elevator, voices raised in surprise, the distinctive sound of military boots on hospital floors. Tessa looked up to see them, Two MPS in full-dress uniform, flanking a man who commanded space like he owned gravity itself. General Marcus Blackwood stood 6'3", his four-star insignia catching the fluorescent light like a warning. His jaw was carved from stone, his eyes the color of winter storms. Behind him, almost invisible in their efficiency, three members of what Tessa recognized as special operations moved with predatory grace. The ICU fell silent. General Blackwood's eyes swept the corridor until they locked onto the nurse's station. "I'm here to see Dr. Victor Crane. Now!" Diane Sutton materialized from nowhere, her professional mask firmly in place. "General Blackwood, Dr. Crane wasn't expecting... Page him." It wasn't a request. Sutton grabbed the phone with trembling hands. Tessa stayed frozen by the medication cart, trying to become part of the furniture. But the general's eyes found her anyway, and she saw Avery's fury reflected there, amplified by decades of command and the weight of military authority. "You're Tessa Morgan," he said it like reading off a tactical brief. "Yes, sir." "You examined my daughter 2 nights ago." "I did, sir." "And you found something." He took 3 steps closer, and Tessa felt the force of his presence like atmospheric pressure. Something that 18 years of specialists missed. The corridor had gone so quiet Tessa could hear her own heartbeat. Dr. Crane appeared from the stairwell, his confident stride faltering when he saw the general. Behind him, the 2 residents who'd witnessed Tessa's humiliation suddenly looked very interested in their shoes. "General Blackwood," Crane recovered smoothly, extending his hand. "This is unexpected. I wasn't aware you'd returned from... Tell me about the membrane." Crane's professional smile froze. "I'm sorry?" "The membrane obstruction. The one Nurse Morgan identified in my daughter's eyes." Crane's gaze flicked to Tessa with pure venom before returning to the general. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Morgan is a probationary nurse who made an inexperienced observation that I want you to re-examine my daughter right now, with me present." The color drained from Crane's face. "General, I've examined Avery dozens of times. There is no membrane. What this nurse saw was likely a reflection artifact, or... Then it should take you 30 seconds to prove her wrong." The general's voice dropped to a register that made Tessa's spine straighten on instinct. "Unless there's a reason you'd prefer not to look." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Crane drew himself up, professional dignity wrapped around him like armor. "Of course I'll examine her, General, but I want to be clear. This kind of speculation creates false hope that can be psychologically damaging. I've dedicated my career to Miss Blackwood's care, and I won't have it undermined by, 'My daughter is in room 7. The general cut him off with surgical precision. "You have 2 minutes to get there. And doctor?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the corridor. "If I find out you've been protecting your reputation instead of treating my child, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your career as a consultant for field medics in conflict zones. Are we clear?" Crane's face had gone from pale to gray. "Crystal, sir." The procession moved toward room 7 like a funeral march. The general, the MPs, Crane and his terrified residents, and somehow, inexplicably, Tessa found herself swept along in the wake. Diane Sutton tried to object, but one look from the general silenced her mid-sentence. Avery sat upright in bed, her mother standing beside her with an expression Tessa couldn't read. When the general entered, Avery's face transformed, fear, hope, and desperate love all tangled together. "Dad." "Sweetheart." The general's voice softened in a way that made Tessa's throat tight. He crossed to her bed in 3 strides, taking her hand. "I'm here, and we're going to get answers." He turned to Crane, and the warmth vanished like it had never existed. "Examine her." Crane retrieved the ophthalmoscope with hands that shook microscopically. Tessa watched him dim the lights, position himself, raise the instrument. He spent 30 seconds on each eye, his jaw locked tight, his breathing carefully controlled. When he pulled back, his face had taken on the gray pallor of a man watching his world collapse. "Well?" The general's voice could have cut diamonds. Crane swallowed. "There appears to be bilateral membranous obstruction. Thin, previously undetected due to His voice cracked. Due to the subtlety of presentation. The room went absolutely silent. At Crane, with the focused intensity of a man calculating firing solutions. Previously undetected, the general repeated slowly, each word weighted with implications. For 18 years. The condition is extremely rare, sir. The membrane is nearly transparent, easily overlooked in standard examinations. And how many times have you examined my daughter, Dr. Crane? Crane's throat worked. Over 100, sir. And in 100 examinations, you never saw what this nurse found in one? The residents had pressed themselves against the wall, trying to disappear. Tessa felt the urge to do the same, but the general's presence held everyone in place like a gravitational field. General Blackwood, I understand your anger, but you understand nothing. The general's voice remained quiet, which made it infinitely more terrifying. You stood in this hospital and told my wife that false hope was cruel. You told Nurse Morgan her observation was reckless. You were prepared to have her fired for seeing what you missed. Sir, is this condition treatable? The question hung like an axe above Crane's career. It appears to be surgically correctable, yes. Avery made a sound, half sob, half laugh, entirely broken. Her mother sank into the chair beside the bed, pressing one hand to her mouth. The general's jaw flexed once, twice, before he spoke again. How long have you known? The words were so quiet Tessa almost missed them. Known? Crane's voice climbed an octave. General, I just discovered the chart notes from 7 years ago. Elizabeth Blackwood's voice cut through the room like shattered glass. She'd pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with violent precision across the screen. You documented persistent membrane-like opacity and recommended further investigation. Then you filed a follow-up 3 weeks later stating opacity resolved and no surgical intervention required. The oxygen seemed to drain from the room. Crane had gone from gray to green. Mrs. Blackwood, that notation was inconclusive, and subsequent examinations showed what you needed them to show. The general's words fell like hammer blows. Because admitting you'd missed something 7 years ago would have damaged your reputation. So you buried it. You built a career on my daughter's blindness and called it expert care. That's not... I would never... Get out! The command was delivered in the same tone the general probably used to authorize airstrikes. Crane stumbled backward, his face collapsing, his carefully constructed authority shattering like glass. The residents fled ahead of him, and within seconds, the room contained only the Blackwood family and one very overwhelmed nurse. The general turned to Tessa, and she braced for she didn't know what. Gratitude? Anger that she hadn't pushed harder? But his expression held something else entirely. Respect. Thank you, Nurse Morgan, he said quietly, for seeing what everyone else refused to see. Tessa's voice came out rough. I just did my job, sir. No. Avery spoke from the bed, tears streaming down her clouded eyes. You did more than your job. You risked everything. The weight of it settled over Tessa like a blanket. The risk, the consequences still to come, the career she'd probably destroyed. But looking at Avery's face, at the hope burning there like a beacon, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. What happens now? Tessa asked. The general's expression hardened into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so sharp. Now! Now we make sure this never happens to anyone else's child. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. This is General Blackwood. I need the Inspector General's office. Yes, I'll hold. Through the observation glass, Tessa saw Diane Sutton standing in the corridor, her face pale. Behind her, other staff members clustered in nervous groups, whispering. The invisible nurse had just become very, very visible. And somewhere in the distance, Tessa heard the sound of a career ending. Not hers, but the one that should have ended years ago, when a doctor decided reputation mattered more than truth. The general was still on the phone, his voice clipped and precise as he detailed what would become a formal investigation. Elizabeth sat beside Avery, holding her daughter's hand while silent tears tracked down both their faces. The MPs stood at attention by the door, already transitioning into their new role as witnesses. Tessa backed toward the exit, trying to give the family privacy. Tessa. Avery's voice stopped her. Don't go, please. So Tessa stayed, standing in the corner of room 7 while the world she'd known began its violent reorganization. She'd spent 6 weeks learning to be invisible, mastering the art of silence, accepting her place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Tonight, she'd learned a different lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to disappear. And as the general's voice filled the room with demands for accountability, justice, and consequences, Tessa understood that this was only the beginning. The real battle was about to start. The hospital's administrative wing had never seen a 4-star general before, and the institutional panic showed in every hastily straightened tie and nervous smile. Tessa followed the procession through corridors that seemed to narrow under the weight of military authority, watching senior staff materialize from offices they usually never left. By the time they reached Conference Room C, a crowd had gathered: doctors, administrators, legal counsel, and enough witnesses to fill a courtroom. General Blackwood didn't wait for introductions. He placed a digital recorder on the conference table with the deliberate care of someone laying down a weapon, then looked directly at Hospital Administrator Margaret Voss. "We're going to discuss how my daughter spent 18 years blind because your chief ophthalmologist prioritized his ego over her eyes," he said. "And you're going to explain why a probationary nurse was threatened with termination for doing what your entire medical staff failed to do." Voss had built a career on diplomatic crisis management, but her composure cracked at the edges. "General Blackwood, I understand your frustration, but these are serious allegations that require investigation." "Yes." The general slid a folder across the table. "I've already contacted the Inspector General, the Medical Board, and the Judge Advocate General's office. They'll arrive tomorrow morning. Consider this a courtesy notification." The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tessa stood near the wall, trying to make herself small while every eye in the room occasionally flickered her direction, some grateful, most resentful, all calculating what her existence meant for their careers. Dr. Victor Crane sat 3 chairs down from the general, his distinguished features now looking merely old. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread like he was trying to keep the surface from tilting. 2 hospital attorneys flanked him, their expressions suggesting they'd already begun calculating settlement figures. "Dr. Crane has served this hospital with distinction for 23 years, Voss began carefully. "His record is built on my daughter's suffering." Elizabeth Blackwood spoke from the doorway, her entrance perfectly timed. She held a tablet loaded with medical records, her War College training evident in the way she'd organized her attack. "I've spent the last 4 hours reviewing every examination note, every consultation, every dismissal. May I?" She didn't wait for permission. The tablet connected to the conference room display, and suddenly the wall showed a timeline that looked like evidence at a murder trial. "Age 7, Elizabeth said, her voice clinical. "Dr. Crane notes bilateral membrane opacity, etiology unclear. He recommends follow-up in 3 weeks. She advanced the slide. 3 weeks later, the note reads, "Opacity resolved, no intervention needed." But look at the examination duration, 7 minutes. 7 minutes to overturn a finding that should have changed everything. Crane's attorney leaned forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, ophthalmological conditions can present with variable—" "Don't!" Elizabeth's voice could have frosted windows. "I've taught military strategy for 15 years. I recognize a cover-up when it's documented in triplicate." She advanced through more slides, each one a damning variation on the same theme. Observations made, then minimized. Concerns raised, then dismissed. Questions from other specialists politely redirected away from membrane discussions and toward the safety of permanent congenital blindness. "He saw it," Elizabeth said quietly. "At least once, probably more, but admitting it meant admitting he'd missed it in earlier examinations. So he buried it, and every year after that the burial got deeper." Tessa watched Crane's face crumble in slow motion. This was what consequences looked like when they finally caught up. Not dramatic, just quietly devastating. "I want him criminally charged," the general said. The room erupted. Attorneys spoke over each other. Voss tried to regain control, and someone mentioned due process in a tone suggesting they knew how hollow it sounded. But beneath the chaos, Tessa heard something else. Diane Sutton, whispering to Patricia Hendricks near the door. She destroyed his career. She should have stayed quiet. The words landed like punches. Tessa had saved Avery's sight, exposed malpractice, and done everything right. And still, she was the problem. Not the doctor who'd buried evidence, not the system that enabled him, the nurse who'd refused to stay invisible. Enough! The general's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Here's what's going to happen, doctor. Crane is suspended immediately, pending investigation. Every patient he's declared permanently blind gets re-examined by independent specialists. And the protocols that allowed this, he gestured at the damning timeline, get burned to the ground and rebuilt. Voss looked like she'd swallowed glass. General, the hospital's reputation means nothing compared to my daughter's sight. He stood, and the room instinctively rose with him. You have 24 hours to begin implementation. After that, I stop asking nicely. The meeting dissolved into murmured conversations and hasty exits. Tessa slipped toward the door, but Elizabeth caught her arm. Not you, Miss Morgan. We need to talk. They found privacy in a small consultation room that smelled of recycled air and anxiety. Elizabeth closed the door and leaned against it, studying Tessa with the intensity of someone trained to identify assets and liabilities. You understand what you've started, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. I think so, ma'am. You've made enemies, powerful ones. Doctors who'll see you as a threat. Administrators who'll mark you as a troublemaker. Other nurses who'll resent you for breaking ranks. Elizabeth's expression softened fractionally. In 6 months, you'll struggle to find work anywhere in this state. Tessa's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. I'd do it again. I know. That's why I'm here. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, typed something, then showed Tessa the screen. It was an email draft, addressed to the Surgeon General's office, recommending Tessa for a specialized military nursing program with full scholarship and guaranteed placement. My husband has considerable influence, Elizabeth said, and I have friends in medical administration across 3 service branches. You saved our daughter. We don't forget debts like that. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Tessa could take it, escape Northridge, restart somewhere that valued her observations, build a career protected by military gratitude. All she had to do was accept that she needed saving. Thank you, Tessa said carefully. But I'd like to stay. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. Here? After what they'll put you through? Leaving feels like admitting I did something wrong, and I didn't. Tessa met her eyes. Besides, Avery's still a patient here. Someone should make sure the next doctor actually does their job. For the first time since they'd met, Elizabeth smiled. A real one, sharp and approving. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, ma'am. Good. We'll need both. Elizabeth pocketed her phone. The offer stands if you change your mind. And Miss Morgan, watch your back. Wounded egos are more dangerous than incompetent doctors. The warning proved prophetic faster than Tessa expected. She returned to the ICU floor to find her locker had been cleaned out, her personal items stacked in a cardboard box beside the nurse's station. Diane Sutton waited nearby, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes cold. Administrative decision, Sutton said. You're being transferred to the overnight rotation in General Ward 3, effective immediately. General Ward. 3 was hospital code for where careers go to die. Understaffed, overwhelmed, filled with patients whose conditions were too chronic to be interesting and too stable to be urgent. It was where they sent nurses who'd angered the wrong people, a purgatory disguised as reassignment. On whose authority, Tessa asked. Hospital administration. For your own protection. Sutton's tone suggested she knew exactly how transparent the lie sounded. Emotions are running high. It's better if you're not visible right now. There it was again, that word. Invisible. They'd tried to make her disappear through dismissal, and when that failed, they'd do it through exile. I understand, Tessa said, picking up the box. She didn't fight it. Fighting would give them the excuse they needed to escalate. So she took her box and her reassignment and walked to General Ward 3, where the night shift supervisor, a burnt-out RN named Keith, who looked like he'd stopped caring sometime in the previous decade, barely glanced up from his coffee. You're the one who took down Crane, Keith said. I found a treatable condition that, yeah, I heard. Keith waved her toward the supply closet. Storage is a disaster. Organize it while it's quiet. And Morgan? I don't care about hospital politics. You do your job, we're fine. You bring drama, you're gone. Clear? Crystal. The supply closet was exactly as bad as advertised. Expired medications mixed with current stock, equipment that hadn't been inventoried since the previous administration, and a filing system that seemed designed by someone mid-breakdown. Tessa spent 2 hours creating order from chaos, finding a strange peace in the mechanical simplicity of alphabetization. She was labeling the third shelf when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. They're planning a disciplinary review. Formal complaint filed by nursing board. Thought you should know. A friend. Tessa stared at the message, watching it auto-delete after 30 seconds. Someone was feeding her information, but whether out of genuine friendship or strategic manipulation, she couldn't tell. The institutional machinery had started grinding, and she was caught in its gears. The rest of her shift passed in surreal quiet. General Ward 3 ran on autopilot. Medication rounds, vital checks, documentation that no one would read. The patients here had learned not to expect much, and their gratitude for basic competence felt simultaneously heartwarming and heartbreaking. Around 4 a.m, Tessa found herself in the break room with 2 other night shift nurses, both older, both worn down by years of watching the system crush people who cared too much. You should have kept your mouth shut, one of them said, not unkindly. That's survival rule number 1. And let that girl stay blind? That girl's got family with power. She'd have been fine eventually. But you? You're disposable. The hospital will prove it. The words stung because they were true. Avery had generals and war college professors fighting for her. Tessa had a box of personal items and a transfer to the night shift nobody wanted. But when her shift ended and she walked to her car through pre-dawn darkness, Tessa pulled up the hospital directory on her phone and found Avery's room number. She shouldn't visit. It would be used against her, marked as boundary violation or emotional manipulation. But she needed to see for herself that the risk had been worth it. She found Avery awake, sitting in the chair by her window despite the fact that she couldn't see the sunrise beginning to paint the sky. The general had left, Elizabeth had gone to make calls, and for the first time since the revelation, Avery was alone. "You're not supposed to be here," Avery said when Tessa knocked. "I heard them reassign you." "I'm not staying long." "Good, because if they see you, they'll use it." Avery turned toward Tessa's voice, her clouded eyes reflecting the early light. "They filed a complaint against you. Ethics violation. Practicing outside your scope." "I know. It's bullshit. It's politics." Avery's jaw tightened. "I'm writing a statement. So is my father. We're going to make sure everyone knows you saved me." "That might make it worse," Tessa said gently. "It makes me look like I did this for recognition instead of patient care." "Then what are you supposed to do? Just take it?" "I'm supposed to keep showing up, keep doing my job, let the investigation run its course." Tessa moved to the window, looking out at the city waking up beneath them, and trust that eventually the truth matters more than the politics. "You don't actually believe that?" "No," Tessa admitted, "but I'm going to act like I do until it's true." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse Tessa didn't recognize. Younger, nervous, clearly sent to enforce the boundary. Tessa left before it became an incident, but she caught Avery's expression as she went. The girl who'd been resigned to permanent darkness now looked like she was preparing for war. The disciplinary review was scheduled for the following week, giving Tessa 7 days to watch the institutional machinery calibrate its attack. The formal complaint accused her of performing diagnostic procedures beyond her scope of practice, creating false hope in a vulnerable patient, undermining the attending physician's authority, violating patient care protocols, engaging in behavior that compromised hospital credibility. Each charge was technically defensible if you squinted hard enough and ignored context. Together, they painted a picture of a reckless nurse who'd prioritized ego over patient safety, exactly the opposite of the truth, which meant it would probably stick. Tessa hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in medical employment disputes and had a reputation for not backing down. They're going to argue you overstepped, Torres said during their first meeting, reviewing the complaint with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen this script before. And technically, you did. Ophthalmological examination isn't in your job description. So I should have ignored what I saw? According to protocol? Yes. You should have noted it and informed the attending physician without forming an independent assessment. Torres looked up, her expression grim. That's how the system protects itself. See something, say something, but never do something. That's insane. That's healthcare. Torres set down the complaint. Here's the reality. They're not trying to punish you for being wrong. You were right, and that's the problem. You made senior staff look incompetent. The hospital's facing a malpractice suit that could destroy their reputation, and you're the perfect scapegoat. So what do? We make being wrong more expensive than being right. Torres pulled out her own folder, considerably thicker than the hospital's complaint. Your general's made some calls. We've got 3 independent ophthalmologists willing to testify that the membrane was visible in previous examinations. We've got patient advocacy groups interested in the case. And we've got media outlets asking questions about how many other permanent conditions might actually be medical negligence. Tessa felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but possibility. The hospital wants this quiet, Torres continued. They want you gone without headlines. So we're going to make noise. The noise started 2 days before the review, when the local news ran a human interest piece about the nurse who gave sight to a general's daughter. They'd interviewed Avery, who'd apparently inherited her father's gift for tactical warfare, and the segment painted Tessa as a hero fighting institutional indifference. The hospital's PR department went into damage control, issuing statements about complex medical situations and ongoing internal processes. But the narrative had escaped containment. Social media picked it up. Patient advocacy groups started asking pointed questions. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery, people began recalculating the cost-benefit analysis of sacrificing one nurse. The morning of the review, Tessa dressed in her best professional outfit and tried not to throw up from anxiety. Torres met her in the hospital lobby, carrying a briefcase that looked like it could stop bullets. "Remember," Torres said as they walked toward the conference room, "let me do the talking. Don't apologize for anything. And if they try to make this about insubordination instead of patient care, we walk." The review committee consisted of 5 people, 2 hospital administrators, 1 nursing supervisor, 1 physician representative, and 1 external ethics consultant brought in to provide the appearance of impartiality. They sat behind a long table like judges at a tribunal, their expressions professionally neutral, but their body language suggesting the verdict had been decided before Tessa entered the room. Dr. Crane wasn't present, suspended pending the criminal investigation, but his shadow filled the space anyway. This wasn't about Tessa's conduct. It was about whether the hospital would admit fault or double down on institutional denial. The physician representative, a surgeon named Dr. Raymond Keller, who'd built a career on never admitting mistakes, opened the proceedings. "Miss Morgan, you're here to address concerns about your conduct in the care of patient Avery Blackwood." His tone was neutral, but his eyes were cold. "Specifically, allegations that you performed diagnostic assessments beyond your scope of practice and undermined the medical team's treatment plan." Torres leaned forward. "Before we begin, I'd like to clarify what we're actually discussing. Is my client being disciplined for performing a routine eye examination, something within standard nursing practice, or for being correct when senior staff were wrong?" The external ethics consultant, a woman named Dr. Sarah Vance, who actually seemed interested in truth over politics, made a note. "That's a fair question." "The issue isn't correctness," Keller said. "It's protocol. Nurses don't make independent diagnostic assessments. They observe and report to physicians." "Which is exactly what Miss Morgan did," Torres countered. "She performed a basic examination, noted an abnormality, and attempted to report it to the attending physician. The fact that Dr. Crane dismissed her observation doesn't make her observation inappropriate." She created false hope. She identified a treatable condition that had been missed for 18 years. Torres slid a folder across the table. "We have 3 independent ophthalmologists who reviewed the case. All 3 confirmed that the membrane was visible in multiple prior examinations. All three stated that a reasonably competent specialist should have identified it. The administrators exchanged glances. This was the trap they'd walked into. Defend Crane and admit the hospital employed incompetent specialists, or defend Tessa and admit the system had failed. Dr. Vance opened the folder, scanning the expert opinions with visible interest. These are from respected specialists who had no prior relationship with the patient or the hospital, Torres added. Unlike Dr. Crane, who had 18 years of investment in being right. Keller's jaw tightened. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating documented facts. Dr. Crane noted membrane opacity in his records 7 years ago, then claimed it resolved without surgery. 3 weeks ago, that same membrane required surgical removal. Either he was incompetent then, or negligent now. Either way, Miss Morgan's observation was correct. The room fell silent. Tessa sat perfectly still, watching the committee members process the corners they'd backed themselves into. This wasn't about nursing protocol anymore. It was about whether the hospital would protect a nurse who'd exposed malpractice or sacrifice her to protect the doctors who'd committed it. Miss Morgan, Dr. Vance said, her tone considerably gentler than Keller's, can you walk us through your examination? What specifically made you question the prior diagnoses? Tessa glanced at Torres, who nodded. I saw something that didn't match the chart notes, Tessa said carefully. The documentation described congenital blindness without surgical options, but when I examined Miss Blackwood, I observed a membrane structure consistent with a treatable obstruction. I attempted to report this to Dr. Crane, who dismissed it without re-examination. You're a probationary nurse with 6 weeks' experience, Keller interjected. What made you think you knew better than a chief ophthalmologist with decades of expertise? I didn't think I knew better. I thought I saw something worth investigating. Tessa met his eyes. And I was right. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Keller's face flushed, but before he could respond, the conference room door opened. General Blackwood walked in like he owned the building, which, given military contracts and political influence, wasn't far from truth. Behind him came Elizabeth, Avery, and 3 people Tessa didn't recognize, but whose credentials were probably significant enough to change atmospheres. Apologies for the interruption, the general said in a tone that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. I understand you're reviewing Nurse Morgan's conduct. I thought you might benefit from the patient's perspective. The committee had no choice but to allow it. Avery walked to the front of the room, caution without assistance, navigating the space with the confidence of someone whose world had suddenly expanded beyond darkness. She still wore bandages from the surgery, but her posture radiated defiance. My name is Avery Blackwood, she began, her voice steady. 3 weeks ago, I was blind. Today, I can see light and shapes. In 6 weeks, my surgeon says I'll have near-normal vision. This happened because one nurse looked at me and saw possibility instead of limitations. She turned toward the committee, her bandaged eyes somehow finding each of them. I've been examined by the best ophthalmologists in the country. They told my parents I was hopeless. They built careers on managing my condition instead of curing it, and when someone finally saw what they'd missed, you tried to punish her for it. Avery's voice hardened. So let me be very clear. If you discipline Nurse Morgan, you're not protecting medical standards. You're protecting the doctors who failed me. The silence that followed felt dense enough to crush stone. One of the men who'd entered with the general stepped forward. Dr. James Patterson, Ophthalmology Department, Walter Reed. I've reviewed this case extensively. The membrane was visible in examinations dating back at least 8 years. Miss Morgan's observation was not only appropriate, it was the first competent assessment this patient received. Another expert added her voice, then another, each one systematically dismantling the foundation the hospital had built its case on. Tessa watched the committee members' expressions shift from defensive to calculating. They were doing the math, weighing the cost of their decision against the price of being wrong in public. Keller tried one last offensive. General Blackwood, we appreciate your input, but this review is about hospital protocols, not about protecting your reputation, the general cut him off. I understand. I've seen this before. Institutions sacrificing good people to avoid admitting systemic failure. But here's what you need to understand. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet. My daughter can see. That nurse made it happen. And if you punish her for saving my child, I will spend every resource at my disposal ensuring this hospital becomes a case study in how bureaucracy kills patients. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who'd toppled governments and ended careers. The review committee called a recess. 15 minutes that felt like hours. When they returned, Dr. Vance delivered the verdict with the careful precision of someone choosing words for the historical record. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this committee finds that Nurse Morgan's actions, while unconventional, fell within the bounds of acceptable patient care. Her observation was appropriate, her attempt to report was proper, and the subsequent validation of her assessment demonstrates sound clinical judgment. Vance paused, making eye contact with each committee member before continuing. No disciplinary action will be taken. Furthermore, this committee recommends a comprehensive review of protocols that may have contributed to the original diagnostic failure. It was the smallest possible admission of fault, carefully worded to avoid direct blame, but it was victory nonetheless. Keller looked like he'd swallowed poison. The administrators maintained their professional masks, but couldn't quite hide the defeat in their eyes. And Tessa felt something unknot in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the absence of the crushing weight she'd carried for weeks. Torres packed up her briefcase with the satisfied efficiency of someone who'd just won against bad odds. The general shook Tessa's hand with genuine warmth, and Avery hugged her tight enough to make breathing difficult. "Thank you," Avery whispered, "for everything." But as the room emptied and Tessa walked back toward General Ward 3, she noticed the looks from passing staff. Not gratitude, not respect. Something colder, more resentful. "You're being transferred back to ICU." "You're being transferred back to ICU," Sutton said, effective immediately. Administrator's orders. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like strategy. Keep your enemies close, watch them carefully, wait for them to slip. "Understood," Tessa said. "And Morgan?" Sutton's voice dropped. "Don't mistake winning for acceptance. You embarrassed a lot of powerful people. They have long memories." Tessa returned to the ICU that evening, her box of personal items restored to a locker that had been scrubbed clean of any evidence she'd been exiled. The other nurses greeted her with careful neutrality, not quite hostile, not quite welcoming, their professionalism a shield against having to choose sides. Patricia Hendricks passed her in the corridor without speaking. Keith from General Ward 3 sent a text. "Heard you're leaving. Good luck. You'll need it." And in room 7, where Avery was being prepared for discharge now that her post-surgical recovery was progressing, Tessa found a handwritten note on her station. "They're not done with you. Be careful. The system protects itself." No signature, no indication who'd written it. But the warning was clear enough. Tessa crumpled the note and started her shift, checking vitals and administering medications with the same careful competence she'd maintained since day one. She'd learned the rules now. Speak up and face consequences. Stay silent and become complicit. There was no safe path, only choices about which battles were worth fighting. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. Crane's lawyer is arguing diminished capacity, trying to reduce charges. They're offering him a deal. Resign quietly, keep his license, no criminal record. Thought you should know. Tessa stared at the message, watching it auto-delete. After everything, the exposure, the evidence, the public testimony, they were still finding ways to let him escape real consequences. The system was protecting itself, exactly as promised. She was still processing this when the elevator doors opened and 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their federal credentials visible from across the corridor. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who'd done this before, heading straight for the administrative wing. Inspector General's office, the investigation the general had demanded. The real accounting was about to begin, and Tessa understood with sudden clarity that she'd only seen the opening act. Everything that had happened so far, the exposure, the review, the vindication, was just positioning for whatever came next. She watched the federal investigators disappear into the administrative wing, then return to her patients, to the work that had started all of this. Somewhere in the building, people were making calculations, destroying evidence, preparing defenses. The institutional machinery had shifted from damage control to survival mode, and Tessa Morgan, the invisible nurse who'd refused to stay quiet, stood stood at the center of the storm she'd created, wondering if truth actually mattered enough to survive what happened when power felt threatened. The answer, she suspected, was about to become very, very clear. The federal investigators worked through the night like surgeons in an operating theater, extracting documents and digital records with methodical precision. Tessa watched from the ICU floor as boxes accumulated in the administrative wing, each one presumably filled with evidence that would either vindicate her instincts or reveal how deep the institutional rot actually went. She finished her midnight rounds trying not to think about what those boxes might contain, but the anxiety sat in her stomach like swallowed glass. At 3 a.m, her phone buzzed. Not an unknown number this time, Rebecca Torres, her attorney. They found more, Torres said without preamble. At least 6 other patients Crane diagnosed as permanently blind. The IG's office is pulling all their files. Tessa's hand tightened around the phone. 6? That they've identified so far. Could be more. Torres's voice carried the grim satisfaction of someone who'd suspected the worst and been proven right. They're scheduling emergency re-examinations. If even one of those cases shows the same membrane obstruction, it's not malpractice anymore, it's systemic negligence. And the hospital knew, had to know. Papers rustled on Torres's end. I'm seeing email chains between Crane and administration going back years, references to managing patient expectations and avoiding unnecessary surgical risks. That's code for protecting reputation over providing care. Tessa leaned against the nurse's station, watching the early morning darkness through the ICU windows. Somewhere in this building, 6 people had been told their blindness was permanent when it might not be. 6 families who'd reorganized their entire lives around a diagnosis that could have been wrong. The scope of it made her dizzy. What happens now? She asked. Now. The investigation goes from internal review to federal case. Medical board gets involved, probably congressional inquiry given the military connection. Torres paused. And you become a very important witness, which means you also become a very attractive target. Target for what? Discrediting. They can't fight the evidence, so they'll fight your credibility. Expect them to dig into everything, your employment history, your training, any mistakes you've ever made. They'll try to paint you as attention-seeking, incompetent, anything that makes your observations seem unreliable. Tessa thought about her 6 weeks at Northridge, the careful documentation she'd maintained, the protocols she'd followed even when they felt wrong. She'd been so focused on being invisible that she'd inadvertently created a paper trail of competence. Let them dig, she said quietly. I've got nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide. The question is whether they'll find it before the truth stops mattering. Torres hung up, leaving Tessa alone with that unsettling thought. She returned to her patients, to the rhythm of vital checks and medication administration, finding comfort in the simple clarity of tasks that had definite right answers. But the comfort lasted exactly 40 minutes, until Diane Sutton appeared at the nurse's station with an expression that promised complications. Conference room, now. The room was smaller this time, more intimate, which somehow made it more threatening. Hospital Administrator Margaret Voss sat at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital's chief legal counsel and someone Tessa didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s with the kind of expensive suit that suggested serious institutional power. Miss Morgan, this is Dr. Helen Krauss from the American Nursing Association, Voss said. She's here to discuss your conduct during the Blackwood case. Dr. Krauss smiled with professional warmth that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Morgan, I want to start by saying we recognize the positive outcome in Miss Blackwood's case. However, there are concerns about the precedent your actions set for nursing practice. Tessa felt the trap being constructed around her, each word a carefully placed snare. What kind of precedent? She asked. The precedent of nurses making independent diagnostic assessments that contradict physician findings. Krauss opened a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be prepared notes. Healthcare operates on a collaborative model with clear scope of practice boundaries. When those boundaries are crossed, even with good intentions, it creates liability issues and undermines the physician-led care model. I didn't contradict a physician. I made an observation and attempted to report it. You performed an ophthalmological examination, the legal counsel interjected. That's outside standard nursing practice. I used an ophthalmoscope to assess a patient's condition. That's basic nursing assessment, with the specific intent to challenge an established diagnosis, with the intent to provide complete patient care. The semantic warfare continued for 20 minutes, each side translating the same actions into different narratives. Krauss wanted Tessa to acknowledge overstepping, to provide a soundbite that could be used to reinforce professional boundaries. Voss wanted documentation that the hospital had addressed the concerns, proof that institutional protocols were being reinforced even while the investigation burned through the administrative wing. But beneath the careful language, Tessa heard what they were really saying. Be the example that teaches other nurses to stay quiet. Let me be direct, Krauss said finally, abandoning the professional warmth for something sharper. The nursing community is watching this case. If your actions are celebrated, we'll see an increase in nurses challenging physician authority, practicing outside their scope, creating legal nightmares for hospitals across the country. Is that really the legacy you want? I want sick people to get better, Tessa said. If that requires questioning authority, then yes, that's exactly the legacy I want. Krauss's expression hardened. Then you're being willfully naive about how healthcare actually functions. Or maybe healthcare is functioning wrong. The room went silent. Voss looked like she'd swallowed something toxic, and the legal counsel's pen froze mid-note. Krauss studied Tessa with the intensity of someone reassessing a threat level. I see, Krauss said quietly. Well, Miss Morgan, I hope your idealism survives what comes next. The meeting ended with nothing resolved, just positions entrenched and battle lines drawn. Tessa returned to the ICU, feeling like she'd been through combat, only to find Patricia Hendricks waiting at her station with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been concern. You should know they're planning a staff meeting, Patricia said without preamble. Tomorrow afternoon, mandatory attendance. They're going to present new protocols for reporting concerns about attending physician diagnoses. Let me guess, more bureaucracy, more barriers to actually helping patients. More protection for the hospital when the next lawsuit hits. Patricia crossed her arms. Look, I don't like you. I think you're reckless and self-righteous. But I've been doing this for 20 years and I've seen what happens to nurses who fight the system. It doesn't matter if you're right. They'll grind you down until you quit or break. So I should just accept it? You should pick battles you can actually win. Patricia's voice dropped. The investigators found something in Crane's files. Patient complaints going back a decade. Parents questioning diagnoses, other doctors raising concerns. All of it documented and buried. The hospital knew, Morgan. They knew, and they kept him on staff because he brought in military contracts and research grants. Tessa felt her breath catch. Why are you telling me this? Because when this goes public, and it will, they're going to need a scapegoat, and you've already painted a target on yourself. Patricia's expression softened fractionally. I'm telling you this because watching them destroy you won't bring me any satisfaction. So be smart, document everything, trust no one, and for the love of everything, stop talking to reporters. I haven't talked to any reporters. Not yet, but they're circling. And the minute you give them a quote, the hospital will use it to paint you as attention-seeking. Patricia left, and Tessa spent the next hour trying to process the warning. She'd thought the victory at the disciplinary review meant something, but Patricia was right. It had only escalated the stakes. The hospital wasn't trying to fire her anymore. They were trying to isolate her, discredit her, turn her into a cautionary tale that would keep every other nurse in line. Her shift ended at 7, but Tessa stayed an extra hour finishing documentation that didn't strictly need finishing. The truth was, going home meant facing the emptiness of her apartment, the reality that she'd sacrificed any semblance of normal life for a job that was actively trying to destroy her. Staying meant maintaining the fiction that work could still be just work. She was logging out when the elevator doors opened and General Blackwood stepped out, his civilian clothes somehow making him look more dangerous than his uniform ever had. He scanned the floor with tactical precision, locked onto Tessa, and crossed to her with purposeful strides. Miss Morgan, I need 10 minutes of your time. They found privacy in the same small consultation room where Elizabeth had offered her an escape route. The general closed the door and turned to face her with an expression that managed to be both appreciative and deeply concerned. The Inspector General's preliminary findings are catastrophic, he said without preamble. 6 confirmed cases of misdiagnosis, possibly 12 more under review. Email evidence of administrative knowledge dating back 8 years. They're building a case for criminal negligence and institutional fraud. Tessa's mouth went dry. Criminal? Crane prescribed unnecessary medications to patients he knew might be treatable. That's fraud. The hospital billed insurance for ongoing management of permanent conditions that weren't permanent. More fraud. And the cover-up involves multiple administrators who suppressed complaints and buried evidence. The general's jaw flexed. This is going to be a federal prosecution. Multiple defendants. And you're going to be the primary witness. The weight of it settled over Tessa like a physical force. She'd wanted justice, but she'd imagined something cleaner. Doctors losing licenses. Hospitals implementing reforms. Maybe some settlements. Not criminal trials and federal prosecutions, and the full machinery of legal warfare. I just wanted to help a patient, she said quietly. I know, but what you found is bigger than one patient. Bigger than my daughter. The general moved to the window, looking out at the city with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too many battles. The prosecutor's office will contact you within 48 hours. They'll want complete testimony, documentation, everything. And when this goes to trial, the defense will tear into you like you're an enemy combatant. I understand. Do you? He turned back to her, and his expression had shifted to something almost paternal. They'll question your competence, your judgment, your motivations. They'll suggest you were seeking attention, or that you had a grudge against Dr. Crane, or that you're too inexperienced to reliably assess what you saw. They'll make you doubt yourself in front of a jury. I know what I saw. Then hold on to that, because they're going to try very hard to make you forget. The general left, and Tessa sat alone in the consultation room, feeling the walls close in. She'd started this wanting to help one blind girl see. Now she was the linchpin in a federal case that would probably destroy careers, bankrupt a hospital, and reshape how medical negligence was prosecuted. The scope terrified her. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when her phone rang. Unknown number, but this time she answered. Miss Morgan, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen from the District Prosecutor's Office. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your testimony in the Blackwood case and related matters. Related matters. That was prosecutor speak for the expanding investigation into every patient Crane had misdiagnosed, every administrator who'd enabled it, every system failure that had let it continue for years. When? Tessa asked. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Federal Building downtown. Bring any documentation you have, notes, observations, communications, and Miss Morgan, don't discuss this case with anyone else. That includes hospital staff, media, or other potential witnesses. The line went dead before she could respond. Tessa stared at her phone, watching the call log update, and understood that she'd just crossed a threshold into something irreversible. She was no longer a nurse who'd made an observation. She was a federal witness in a criminal investigation. The mandatory staff meeting happened the next afternoon, exactly as Patricia had warned. Tessa sat in the back of the auditorium, watching 300 hospital employees file in with expressions ranging from confused to resentful. Margaret Voss took the stage with the grim determination of someone delivering a eulogy. As many of you know, Northridge is currently under federal investigation, Voss began, her voice carrying across the space with practiced authority. This investigation involves allegations of medical malpractice and administrative negligence in the ophthalmology department. While we cannot discuss specifics due to ongoing legal proceedings, I want to assure you that we are cooperating fully with federal authorities. The corporate speak continued for 10 minutes. Commitments to patient safety, promises of protocol review, assurances that this was an isolated incident. But Tessa watched the faces around her and saw people doing math, calculating their own exposure, wondering which of their own decisions might come under scrutiny. Then Voss dropped the hammer. Effective immediately, we are implementing new protocols for staff concerns about physician diagnoses. Any nurse, technician, or support staff who wishes to question an attending physician's assessment must submit a formal written concern through the Patient Safety Office, which will be reviewed by a medical board before any action is taken. Translation: more barriers, more bureaucracy, more ways to quietly kill observations that threaten the hierarchy. This ensures proper channels are followed and protects both patients and staff from hasty decisions based on incomplete information, Voss continued. We want to encourage communication while maintaining appropriate scope of practice boundaries. Patricia had been right. They were using this case to tighten control, to make sure the next Tessa Morgan would be buried in paperwork before she could reach a patient. But then someone in the middle of the auditorium stood up. Young resident, early 30s, with the kind of exhausted determination that suggested he'd been here before. "What about the patients Dr. Crane diagnosed as permanently blind?" he asked, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Are we re-examining all of them? Because if there are 6 confirmed misdiagnoses, how many more did we miss?" Voss's composure cracked fractionally. "Those cases are under review by independent specialists appointed by the Inspector General's office. So we let federal investigators clean up our mess instead of taking responsibility ourselves?" The auditorium erupted. Voices overlapped, some supportive, others defensive. The whole institutional fabric threatening to tear under the weight of collective guilt and self-preservation. Voss tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The questions had been asked in public, witnessed by hundreds of people who would remember. Tessa slipped out during the chaos, unwilling to be recognized, unwilling to become the focal point of emotions she couldn't navigate. She made it to the parking garage before someone caught up with her, Diane Sutton, moving faster than Tessa had ever seen her move. "Wait," Sutton said, slightly out of breath. "I need to tell you something." Tessa stopped, wary. Sutton had been one of her earliest critics, one of the voices insisting she stay invisible. "I was wrong about you," Sutton said quietly. "I spent 20 years teaching nurses to follow orders, stay in their lane, not make waves. And I told myself it was about patient safety, about maintaining standards. But watching this unfold," she trailed off, something breaking in her expression. "I was teaching them to be complicit. And I'm sorry." The apology hung between them like something fragile. "I don't need an apology," Tessa said. "I need the system to change." "It won't, not really. They'll implement new protocols, issue statements, maybe fire a few administrators. But the fundamental structure, the hierarchy that protects doctors over patients, that stays intact." Sutton met her eyes. "Unless people like you keep pushing, keep refusing to be invisible, people like me get destroyed. Sometimes. But sometimes they change everything." Sutton handed her a folder. "These are copies of my personnel files from the last 5 years. Documentation of other incidents where nursing observations were dismissed or buried. I'm sending them to the IG's office, but I wanted you to have copies too, in case something happens to me." Tessa took the folder with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I have a daughter your age, and I don't want her working in a system where speaking up is career suicide." Sutton turned to leave, then paused. "Be careful, Morgan. You've made powerful enemies, and they're running out of ways to stop you legally." The warning echoed in Tessa's mind as she drove to the federal building the next morning, the folder from Sutton locked in her trunk along with her own documentation. The assistant U.S. Attorney's office occupied the 11th floor, all glass and steel and the quiet efficiency of people building cases that destroyed lives. James Chen turned out to be younger than his voice suggested, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of focused intensity that came from prosecuting cases you believed in. He sat across from Tessa in a conference room lined with evidence boxes, a digital recorder between them like a referee. "I'm going to be direct, Miss Morgan," Chen began. "We're building a RICO case, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. That means we're not just prosecuting individual malpractice. We're arguing that Northridge Medical operated as a criminal enterprise, systematically defrauding patients and insurance companies while covering up negligent care." Tessa felt the air leave her lungs. "RICO? That's organized crime." That's exactly what this was. Organized, systematic, profit-driven negligence with a cover-up that involved multiple departments. Chen pulled up files on his laptop, turning the screen toward her. "We've identified 14 patients so far. 14 people told they were permanently blind when they had treatable conditions. Crane billed over $3 million in ongoing management fees for these patients. The hospital collected millions more in insurance payments for specialized care that wasn't necessary." The numbers made Tessa's head spin. "I just saw a membrane in one patient's eyes." and that observation unraveled the largest medical fraud case in this district's history. Chen leaned forward. Your testimony is crucial. You're the nurse who identified the first case, who stood up to institutional pressure, who forced the re-examination. Juries love witnesses like you, credible, sympathetic, motivated by patient care rather than money. What do you need from me? Everything. Complete timeline of your observations, every interaction with Dr. Crane, all communications with hospital administration. We'll prep you for testimony, run you through cross-examination scenarios, make sure you're ready for what the defense will throw at you. Chen's expression softened slightly. And I need you to understand, this will be brutal. The defense will hire investigators to dig into your past. They'll depose everyone you've ever worked with. They'll try to find anything that makes you look unreliable or vindictive or incompetent. I've already been through the hospital's disciplinary review. That was practice. The actual trial will be worse. Chen pulled out a thick folder. This is preliminary opposition research, what we expect the defense to use. Hospital records showing you've been employed at 4 different facilities in 3 years. Performance reviews that mention difficulty accepting authority and tendency to question established protocols. An incident at your previous hospital where you reported a medication error that turned out to be a documentation issue. Tessa remembered each incident. The rotation through different hospitals because none of them felt right. Because she kept seeing corners being cut and patients being overlooked. The performance reviews that praised her clinical skills but marked her down for not fitting seamlessly into hierarchies. The medication error that had been her mistake but had led to improving their entire documentation system. They're going to paint me as a troublemaker who can't hold a job, she said quietly. Yes, and we're going to paint you as a dedicated nurse who prioritizes patients over politics. But you need to be prepared for how personal this gets. Chen closed the folder. The defense will try to break you on the stand. They'll suggest you fabricated the membrane observation to get attention. They'll imply you had a grudge against Dr. Crane. They'll question every decision you made, every word you spoke, until you doubt your own memory. I won't break. Everyone breaks eventually. The question is whether you break before or after the jury believes you. The deposition lasted 6 hours. Chen and his team walked Tessa through every detail of her time at Northridge. Her first day, her assignment to Avery's case, her examination, her confrontation with Crane, the disciplinary review, everything. They recorded her responses, noted inconsistencies, flagged areas where the defense might attack. By the time they finished, Tessa felt hollowed out, every memory examined and dissected until it barely felt real anymore. You did well, Chen said as he walked her to the elevator. But understand, this is just the beginning. The trial probably won't start for another 6 months. That's 6 months of living with this, 6 months of watching the hospital try to discredit you, 6 months of waiting for the other shoe to drop. What other shoe? Chen's expression darkened. The defense is already filing motions. They're arguing that your testimony should be excluded because you're not a qualified expert. They're requesting all your personnel files, your medical school applications. Yes, we know you applied and didn't get in. Your financial records, everything. They're building a narrative that you're a failed medical student taking revenge on successful doctors. Tessa had applied to medical school 7 years ago, fresh out of undergrad with dreams and debt. The rejections had been crushing, each one a door closing on the future she'd imagined. She'd become a nurse instead, telling herself it was just as meaningful, just as important. And it was. Except now that choice would be weaponized against her. I became a nurse because I wanted to help people, she said. I know, but the defense will say you became a nurse because you couldn't become a doctor, and this case is your way of proving you're smarter than the physicians who rejected you. Chen pressed the elevator button. I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but to prepare you. The truth won't protect you. Only your ability to defend it will. The elevator doors opened. Tessa stepped inside, turned back to face Chen, and saw something in his expression that looked almost like pity. One more thing, Chen said as the doors began closing. If at any point this becomes too much, if you want to withdraw your testimony, tell me immediately. We have other witnesses, other evidence. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for this case. The doors closed before Tessa could respond, carrying her down through the federal building toward a parking garage that felt like descending into darkness. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to remember why she'd thought any of this was worth it. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number, but the message made her blood run cold. You should have stayed quiet. Now you'll learn what happens to nurses who forget their place. No name, no signature, just a threat delivered with the casual certainty of someone who expected to be obeyed. Tessa stared at the message, watching it auto-delete, and felt fear slide down her spine like ice water. Someone was escalating beyond legal maneuvering and institutional pressure. Someone had decided she was enough of a threat to warrant intimidation. She forwarded the message details to Chen, to Torres, to General Blackwood. Then she started her car and drove back to Northridge because running would only prove she could be scared into submission. The ICU felt different when she arrived for her shift. The air heavier, the glances sharper, like everyone knew something she didn't. Patricia avoided eye contact. Diane Sutton was nowhere to be found. And when Tessa checked the assignment board, her name wasn't on it. She found the night supervisor in his office, a different man than usual, someone she didn't recognize. Morgan, he said without looking up from his paperwork. You've been reassigned, effective immediately. Check with HR in the morning for your new placement. Reassigned to where? I don't have those details. Just administrative decision. On whose authority? Hospital administration. Take it up with them during business hours. Tessa stood in the doorway, feeling the trap close around her. They couldn't fire her, not with federal investigators watching, but they could exile her, marginalize her, make her invisible again in ways that didn't require justification. This is retaliation, she said quietly. The supervisor finally looked up, his expression sympathetic but resigned. This is survival. The hospital's being sued for $800 million. Everyone's protecting themselves however they can. Your collateral damage. Tessa left the ICU, left the hospital, drove home through rain that matched her mood. Her apartment felt like a cell, small, empty, offering no protection from what was coming. She made tea she didn't drink, started a bath she didn't take, tried to read case files she couldn't focus on. Around midnight, her phone rang. Rebecca Torres, voice tight with urgency. They just filed emergency motions to seal your testimony and exclude you as a witness. They're arguing you're unreliable, biased, and your testimony would be prejudicial. Can they do that? They can try. We'll fight it, but Tessa, they're moving fast. Coordinated legal assault from multiple angles. This isn't just the hospital anymore. This is expensive defense attorneys being paid to destroy your credibility before the case goes to trial. So what do I do? Torres was quiet for a long moment. You could withdraw. Take the general's offer, transfer to military nursing, disappear from this case entirely. The prosecution has other witnesses, and you'd be safe. Safe from what? From whatever they're willing to do to win. The words hung in the air like prophecy. Tessa closed her eyes, thinking about Avery seeing light for the first time, about the 14 other patients who might get the same chance, about every nurse who'd been told to stay quiet and had obeyed. I'm not withdrawing, she said. Then you need to understand what you're committing to. This will consume your life for the next year, maybe longer. Every mistake you've ever made will be public record. Every relationship will be scrutinized. They'll offer you settlements to go away, threaten you with countersuits if you don't, and make your professional life miserable whether you testify or not. I know. And you're still doing this? Someone has to. Torres exhaled slowly. Then we fight. But Tessa, lock your doors, vary your routine. Don't talk to anyone you don't absolutely trust, because if they're willing to threaten you, they might be willing to do worse. The call ended, leaving Tessa alone with that thought. She checked the locks twice, wedged a chair under the door handle, and tried to sleep while her mind replayed every interaction, every decision, looking for the moment where this had stopped being about helping a patient and started being warfare. She was still awake at 3 a.m. when her phone buzzed one more time. Not a text, an email from an address she didn't recognize, with an attachment that loaded slowly on her screen. It was a photograph. Tessa standing outside the federal building that morning, clearly identifiable, clearly being watched. No caption, no message, just proof that someone had been there, documenting her movements, close enough to capture detail. Her hand shook as she forwarded it to Torres, to Chen, to the general's private email. Then she sat in the darkness of her apartment, listening to every creak and settling noise, understanding that the battle had moved beyond courtrooms and conference rooms into something more visceral and immediate. She'd wanted justice. She'd demanded accountability. And now someone had decided that the price for both was making her afraid enough to reconsider. But fear, Tessa was discovering, could be transformed into fuel if you were angry enough. And she was angry. At the doctors who'd chosen reputation over patients, at the administrators who'd enabled them, at the system that punished honesty and rewarded silence. She pulled out her laptop and began documenting everything, creating a digital record of every threat, every reassignment, every attempt to silence her. If they were going to make this personal, she'd make it permanent, evidence that would survive whether she did or not. The sun rose over a city that didn't know it was about to watch a trial that would reshape medical accountability. Tessa showered, dressed, and prepared for whatever the hospital had planned for her reassignment, carrying with her the weight of 14 patients who deserved better and the absolute certainty that backing down now would make every threat they'd issued worthwhile. She arrived at Northridge just before 7, walking through the employee entrance with her head high despite exhaustion and fear. The HR office was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in administrative territory where patients never went, and staff only visited when their careers were being adjusted. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Pemberton, who'd probably perfected the art of delivering bad news in bureaucratic language. She sat behind her desk with a file folder that looked ominously thin. "Miss Morgan, thank you for coming in." Pemberton's smile was professionally sympathetic. "I'm afraid we need to discuss your current placement at Northridge." I assumed that's why I was reassigned without notice or explanation. "Yes? Well, given the ongoing legal proceedings and the attention your case has generated, we feel it's best for everyone if you're placed on administrative leave. Paid, of course, until the investigation concludes." Administrative leave. The corporate equivalent of house arrest. Removed from patient care, isolated from colleagues, rendered professionally invisible while they waited for her to either break or disappear. "And if I refuse?" Pemberton's smile tightened. "It's not a request, Miss Morgan. It's a directive from senior administration for your protection in the hospitals." "My protection from what?" "From the stress and scrutiny that comes with being involved in such a high-profile case. We're concerned about your well-being." The lie was so transparent it would have been funny if it weren't terrifying. Tessa leaned forward, holding Pemberton's gaze. "Let me be very clear. I will not accept administrative leave. I'm a nurse, and I'm here to provide patient care. If you want me gone, you'll have to fire me and explain to federal investigators why you terminated the primary witness in their criminal case." Pemberton's professional mask cracked slightly. "Miss Morgan, I strongly advise—" "I'm declining your advice. Am I being terminated?" "No, but then I'm reporting for my shift. Whatever assignment you want to give me, I'll take it, but I'm not going home to wait while you figure out how to make me disappear." Tessa stood and walked out before Pemberton could respond, her heart hammering but her stride steady. She made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up to the confrontation. The elevator doors opened on the ICU floor, and Tessa stepped out to find General Blackwood waiting like he'd been summoned by the universe to witness this specific moment. He stood near the nurse's station with his arms crossed, his expression carved from granite. "They tried to put you on leave," he said. Not a question. "They tried. And you refused." "I did." The general studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Sharp, definitive, the kind of approval that came from recognizing a fellow soldier. "Good. Because we just got the preliminary re-examination results. 3 more patients with removable membrane obstructions. 3 more people who could have seen years ago if anyone had looked properly." The number hit Tessa like a physical blow. 3 more. Added to the original 6, that made 9 confirmed cases of malpractice so catastrophic it defied comprehension. "How many more are they examining?" she asked. 47. Every patient Crane diagnosed with permanent blindness in the last 12 years. The general's jaw flexed. "And if even half of them were misdiagnosed, we're looking at the largest medical fraud case in state history." Tessa leaned against the wall, trying to process the scope. 47 lives, 47 families, 47 futures built around a diagnosis that might have been wrong from the beginning. The prosecutor wants to meet again, the general continued. They're accelerating the timeline. Grand jury indictment expected within 2 weeks instead of 2 months. They want to move fast before the defense can bury this in procedural warfare. What does that mean for me? It means everything speeds up. The attacks, the pressure, the attempts to break you, all of it happens faster and harder than we expected. He moved closer, lowering his voice. My wife and I discussed this. We want to offer you protection, security detail, temporary housing away from your apartment, anything you need to stay safe until the trial. The offer was generous, maybe even necessary, but accepting it felt like admitting she was in danger, and once she admitted that, fear might win. I appreciate it, sir, but I can't hide. It makes me look like I have something to be afraid of. You do have something to be afraid of. People are threatening you. Let them. I've got nothing left to lose except my credibility and running damages that more than staying visible. The general's expression shifted to something between respect and frustration. You're either incredibly brave or dangerously stubborn. My mother always said I was both. Smart woman. He handed her a card with a phone number written on the back. This is my direct line. You use it if anything, and I mean anything, feels wrong. Time of day doesn't matter. You call, and I respond. Understood? Yes, sir. He left, and Tessa tucked the card in her pocket like a talisman. The ICU hummed around her with the familiar rhythm of monitored heartbeats and ventilator cycles, the machinery of survival operating whether anyone was paying attention or not. She was logging into the system to see where they'd reassigned her when the ICU charge nurse appeared, a woman named Rachel Kim, who'd always been professionally distant but never hostile. They assigned you to room 12, Rachel said quietly. New admission, 26-year-old blind since birth, transferred from another facility for secondary evaluation. The irony was so thick Tessa almost laughed. They'd assigned her to another blind patient, probably hoping she'd stay far away from any diagnostic assessment that might create more problems. But room 12 meant patient care. It meant doing the job they couldn't force her to abandon without making their retaliation obvious. Thank you, Tessa said. Morgan? Rachel's voice stopped her. For what it's worth, what you did for the Blackwood girl was right. A lot of us think so, even if we can't say it out loud. The quiet support felt like oxygen after drowning. Tessa nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking, and headed toward room 12. The patient was named Marcus Webb, his chart showing a lifetime of specialist consultations and the same grim verdict: congenital blindness, permanent, no surgical options. Tessa read through the notes with growing unease, seeing familiar patterns. Observations dismissed, questions deflected, the slow ossification of diagnosis into unchangeable truth. She knocked softly and entered to find a young man sitting upright in bed, his posture suggesting someone who'd learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. Hi, I'm Tessa. I'll be your nurse today. They told me about you, Marcus said. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trained not to hope. Said you're the one who found out the general's daughter wasn't actually blind. I observed a treatable condition that had been missed. And now they've got you babysitting me to see if lightning strikes twice. No bitterness in his tone, just resigned understanding of how institutions operated. I'm here to provide nursing care, Tessa said carefully. Nothing more, nothing less. But if you see something, if I see something, I report it, just like I'm supposed to. Marcus was quiet for a moment. They've been examining me since I was 3. Every specialist in 3 states. All of them said the same thing. Nothing to be done. Learn to adapt. Make peace with darkness. You really think there's something they all missed? I don't know, Tessa said honestly, but I'd like permission to examine your eyes, just a basic assessment. Why? What's the point? Because you deserve someone who looks without already knowing the answer. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions: skepticism, desperate hope, fear of disappointment, before settling on determination. "Do it," he said. "Whatever you see, I can handle the truth." Tessa retrieved the ophthalmoscope with hands that had stopped shaking, finding strange calm in the familiar routine. She dimmed the lights, positioned herself, raised the instrument to Marcus's right eye. And there, just behind the iris, barely visible through the cloudiness but unmistakable once you knew what to look for, was the same thin membrane she'd seen in Avery's eyes. Tessa's breath caught. She checked the left eye, found the same obstruction, pulled back to double-check her angle and lighting. No mistake. No artifact. Just the same treatable condition that 14 other patients had been told was permanent blindness. "What?" Marcus's voice had gone sharp. "What did you see?" Tessa set down the ophthalmoscope carefully, her mind racing through protocols and consequences. She should report this to the attending physician, should document and defer to higher authority, should follow every rule that had been reinforced and threatened and weaponized against her. But Marcus was staring at her with blind eyes that might not need to be blind at all, and somewhere in this hospital, administrators were probably waiting for her to make exactly this kind of observation so they could use it to prove she was reckless and unreliable. "I need to get a second opinion," Tessa said carefully. "From who? Another doctor who will tell me I'm hopeless?" "From someone who has no investment in being right or wrong. Someone independent." She pulled out her phone and called General Blackwood's direct line, watching Marcus's expression shift to confusion as she explained what she'd found. The general listened without interrupting. Then his voice came through sharp and clear. "I'm sending Dr. Patterson from Walter Reed. He's already in the city for depositions. He'll be there in 20 minutes. And Miss Morgan? Document everything, photos, notes, exact time, and methodology. If this is what I think it is, we just found case number 10. Tessa hung up and turned back to Marcus, whose hands were gripping the bed rails hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "What's happening?" he asked. "What's happening," Tessa said quietly, "is that you might get to see." 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Tessa documented her examination with meticulous precision, photographing the membrane structure from multiple angles, noting every detail in the medical record. Marcus sat in perfect stillness, his breathing carefully controlled, like moving might shatter whatever fragile possibility had just entered his life. Dr. Patterson arrived with the efficient precision of someone who'd performed this examination dozens of times in the past 3 weeks. He introduced himself to Marcus, explained the procedure, then spent 15 minutes conducting the most thorough ophthalmological assessment Tessa had ever witnessed. When he finally pulled back, his expression was grim. "Bilateral membrane obstruction," Patterson said. "Congenital, removable, completely treatable with standard surgical intervention. Expected outcome: near normal vision within 8 weeks of procedure." Marcus made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Tessa felt her own eyes burning, watching another life transform in real time. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking. "How long could I have seen?" Patterson checked the chart, his jaw tightening as he scrolled through decades of examination notes. "Based on the membrane structure and your age, probably since you were 10. Maybe younger." 16 years. Marcus had spent 16 years blind because no one had looked properly, because the diagnosis had become institutionalized truth, because questioning authority was more dangerous than accepting blindness. "Who did this?" Marcus's voice had gone cold. "Who examined me and missed this?" Patterson turned the chart toward him, though Marcus couldn't see the screen. "Multiple physicians over the years, but the primary ophthalmologist who established the permanent diagnosis and oversaw your ongoing care was Dr. Victor Crane." The name landed like a bomb. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, his entire body going rigid with the kind of rage that came from realizing you'd been stolen from. "I want him prosecuted," Marcus said quietly. "I want everyone who did this held accountable." "They will be," Patterson promised. "The federal investigation now includes your case. And Mr. Webb, you're not alone. We found 9 other patients so far. Probably more to come." 9 others. Plus Marcus made 10. 10 lives damaged by malpractice, so systematic it looked less like mistakes and more like malice. Tessa stepped back, letting Patterson handle the logistics of immediate care transfer and surgical consultation. But as she watched Marcus process the impossible information that his blindness had been preventable, she felt something shift inside her, the last remnants of doubt burning away in the face of absolute clarity. This wasn't about one nurse fighting the system. This was about a system so corrupt it had blinded people for profit and convenience, and she'd accidentally torn the curtain back far enough to expose the rot underneath. Her phone buzzed. Text from Chen, the prosecutor. Heard about case number 10. We're accelerating timeline. Grand jury next week. You need to be ready. Tessa stared at the message, feeling the weight of what ready meant. Ready to testify. Ready to be cross-examined. Ready to have her entire life examined and attacked and weaponized against her credibility. Ready to stand in front of a jury and explain how she'd looked at a patient and seen what 14 specialists had missed or ignored. She was still processing this when Rachel Kim appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with urgency. "Security's here," Rachel said quietly. "They're asking for you." Tessa's stomach dropped. "Why?" "They wouldn't say. But they've got hospital administration with them, and they look serious." Tessa followed Rachel to the nurses' station, where 2 security guards stood flanking Sandra Pemberton from HR and a man in an expensive suit who screamed corporate attorney. Behind them, looking uncomfortable but determined, stood Margaret Voss herself. "Miss Morgan," Voss said with cold formality, "we need you to come with us." "Am I being arrested?" "You're being escorted to a meeting with hospital counsel regarding your continued employment." Translation. They were making their move. Whatever they'd planned, whatever attack they'd prepared, it was happening now. "I'd like my attorney present," Tessa said. "That's your right," the corporate attorney said smoothly. "But this is a preliminary discussion about workplace conduct, not a disciplinary hearing. You're welcome to call counsel, but it will delay proceedings." The trap was obvious. Agree to talk without Torres present and risk saying something they could use against her, or demand legal representation and look like she had something to hide. Tessa pulled out her phone and texted Torres. "Hospital demanding meeting. Re-employment. Should I wait for you?" The response came back in seconds. "Yes. Don't say anything without me there." Stall. "I'll wait for my attorney," Tessa said. Voss's expression hardened. "Miss Morgan, we're trying to handle this professionally." "Then you'll wait 30 minutes for my legal representation to arrive." The standoff played out in the middle of the ICU floor, nurses and doctors watching from careful distances, everyone understanding they were witnessing something that would probably end careers. They just didn't know whose yet. Torres arrived in 25 minutes, power walking through the ICU in a suit that looked like it cost more than Tessa's monthly rent. She assessed the situation in seconds, her expression shifting to battle ready. "What's this about?" Torres demanded. The corporate attorney handed her a folder. "Miss Morgan has been placed under investigation for violation of patient privacy and unauthorized disclosure of protected medical information." Tessa felt the floor tilt. "What?" "The photographs you took of patient Marcus Webb's ophthalmological examination without proper consent and sent to non-hospital personnel constitute HIPAA violations punishable by immediate termination and possible criminal charges." Torres flipped through the folder, her expression darkening. These photos were part of standard medical documentation sent to a consulting specialist for immediate patient care. That's not a HIPAA violation. It's proper protocol. The photos were sent to Dr. Patterson before obtaining written patient consent for specialist consultation. "Verbal consent was obtained and documented in the medical record," Tessa interjected, her voice steadier than she felt. "Patient Marcus Webb explicitly requested independent evaluation and authorized all necessary documentation." "Verbal consent is insufficient for photographic documentation," the attorney countered. "Hospital policy requires written authorization forms for any imaging that leaves hospital servers." Torres stepped forward, her posture shifting to aggressive. "You're reaching. This is retaliation for her testimony in the federal case, and if you pursue this, I'll have motion for sanctions filed before you finish your lunch. This is legitimate workplace conduct investigation. This is targeted harassment of a federal witness, and you know it." Torres turned to Tessa. "Don't say another word. We're leaving." But Voss blocked their path, her professional composure finally cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "If she leaves this building, she's terminated for job abandonment. If you terminate her, you're adding witness intimidation to the federal charges already pending." Torres's voice could have cut glass. "So go ahead, fire her. Give the prosecutor exactly what he needs to argue institutional retaliation. The stalemate stretched for seconds that felt like centuries. Tessa stood at the center of it, watching powerful people calculate costs and benefits while her career hung in the balance. Then Voss's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and her face went absolutely gray. "When?" she asked quietly. Then, "How many reporters?" She hung up and looked at the corporate attorney with an expression that suggested their entire strategy had just detonated. "The Inspector General's office just released preliminary findings to the press," Voss said, her voice hollow. 22 patients. 22 confirmed cases of misdiagnosed blindness. They're holding a press conference in 30 minutes. The silence that followed felt like the moment after an explosion, when the world hasn't yet processed the damage. 22 patients, 22 lives stolen, 22 families destroyed. And Tessa Morgan, invisible, insignificant, probationary nurse Morgan, had found the thread that unraveled everything. The corporate attorney's phone started buzzing, then Pemberton's, then Voss's again. The institutional machinery was going into crisis mode, and Tessa could see the exact moment when they realized she'd stopped being a problem they could solve quietly and become a witness they couldn't afford to lose. "Meeting adjourned," Voss said tersely, already turning away. "We'll reschedule when things settle." They fled like generals abandoning a battlefield, leaving Tessa and Torres standing in the ICU corridor while around them, phones buzzed and news alerts spread like wildfire. Torres pulled out her own phone, scanning the breaking news with grim satisfaction. 22 cases. The prosecutor's going for maximum charges. "This isn't medical malpractice anymore, Tessa. This is criminal enterprise." Tessa leaned against the nurse's station, feeling exhaustion crash over her like a wave. She'd started this wanting to help one blind girl. Now she was the primary witness in a case that would probably send multiple people to prison and bankrupt one of the largest medical centers in the state. "What happens now?" she asked. Torres looked up from her phone, and for the first time since they'd met, her expression held something like awe. "Now? Now you become the most important nurse in America. Every medical board, every hospital administrator, every doctor who's ever dismissed a nurse's observation, they're all watching to see what happens to you." "And what happens to me?" "That depends on whether truth actually matters more than power." Torres's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and her expression shifted to alarm. "Tessa, you need to see this." She turned the phone toward Tessa. It was a news article, already viral, with a headline that made Tessa's blood run cold. "Nurse under investigation for patient privacy violations in landmark medical fraud case." They'd leaked it. Even as the federal findings exploded across every news outlet, someone had leaked the HIPAA investigation to discredit her before the grand jury convened. The war had gone public, and Tessa Morgan was standing at ground zero, watching her name become ammunition in a battle that would determine whether speaking up was heroism or career suicide. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should have stayed invisible." Tessa deleted the text and walked straight into the gathering storm. The hospital lobby had transformed into a war zone of cameras and microphones, reporters shouting questions at anyone in scrubs while security tried to maintain some semblance of order. She spotted the side exit and made it 3 steps before a journalist recognized her from leaked photos already circulating online. "Miss Morgan, is it true you're under investigation for patient privacy violations?" The question triggered a feeding frenzy. Bodies pressed closer, cameras swinging toward her face, voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Tessa froze, her training offering no protocol for this kind of ambush. Then General Blackwood materialized from the chaos like a tactical insertion, his presence creating an immediate buffer zone. 2 MPs appeared behind him, forming a corridor that pushed reporters back through sheer military authority. "No comments," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to ending conversations. "Clear the path." They made it to his vehicle, a black SUV with government plates that screamed federal involvement. The general didn't speak until they'd cleared the hospital parking lot, putting distance between Tessa and the media circus that would define the next news cycle. "They're trying to destroy you before the grand jury convenes," he said finally. The HIPAA leak was coordinated. Someone inside the hospital fed that story to friendly reporters with instructions to run it before the federal findings got traction. It's working, Tessa said quietly, watching the city blur past. My name's already attached to violations instead of solutions. In the short term, yes, but Chen's team expected this. The general navigated through downtown traffic with the precision of someone who'd driven under fire. They're holding a press conference in 90 minutes. Federal charges announced, patient count confirmed, and you standing beside them as the nurse who broke the case open. Tessa's stomach lurched. I can't do a press conference. I'll say something wrong, give them ammunition. You'll do exactly what you did in that ICU room. Tell the truth without apology. He glanced at her, his expression softening fractionally. My daughter can see because you refused to be invisible. 22 other people will see because you kept refusing. That's the story. Everything else is noise. The federal building loomed ahead, its concrete facade looking more like a fortress than a courthouse. Chen met them in the underground parking garage, his expression tight with controlled urgency. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. The defense filed an emergency motion to exclude your testimony based on the HIPAA investigation. Judge is reviewing it now. Can they do that? Tessa asked. They can try. Our counterargument is that the investigation itself is retaliatory and therefore inadmissible. But if the judge disagrees, we lose our primary witness before the grand jury even convenes. Chen led them toward an elevator that required badge access, which is why we're accelerating everything. Press conference in 75 minutes, grand jury presentation tomorrow morning instead of next week, indictments by end of day. That's too fast, Torres said, appearing from a conference room with her own team in tow. Tessa needs more prep time, more coaching on how to handle cross-examination scenarios. We're out of time, Chen interrupted. Every hour we wait gives the defense another opportunity to discredit her. We go now, while the federal findings are still fresh and the public outrage is building. They entered a conference room where a media consultant was already setting up lighting and backdrop, transforming federal space into a stage designed for maximum impact. The consultant, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Cross, assessed Tessa with the clinical detachment of someone who built public narratives for a living. You'll stand between the general and Chen, Diana said, positioning them like chess pieces. Let Chen handle the legal details. General provides the personal testimony. You speak for exactly 90 seconds about why you examined Avery Blackwood and what you found. Then you stop talking. 90 seconds to summarize weeks of 90 seconds to humanize the numbers. They don't need details. They need to see the nurse who cared enough to look when everyone else had stopped looking. Diana handed her a note card with bullet points. Practice this until you can say it without reading. No hesitation, no second guessing, just truth delivered with absolute certainty. Tessa read the talking points, feeling her identity being condensed into sound bites and strategic messaging. But beneath the calculated presentation, the core remained unchanged. She'd seen something wrong and refused to ignore it. She practiced while Chen briefed his team, while the general made calls to contacts in military legal affairs, while Torres reviewed the defense motions looking for vulnerabilities. The federal machinery moved around her with bureaucratic precision, everyone playing their assigned role in a performance designed to prevent powerful people from escaping consequences. 60 minutes before the press conference, Diana pulled Tessa aside for final adjustments, makeup to counter the fluorescent lighting, wardrobe consultation that resulted in keeping her nursing scrubs because authenticity beats polish, and coaching on maintaining eye contact with cameras without looking aggressive. The defense will have people watching, Diana warned. Every word you say gets analyzed for inconsistencies they can exploit later. So stick to the script. Don't elaborate. Don't get emotional. Just deliver your 90 seconds and step back. What if someone asks about the HIPAA investigation? Chen handles all legal questions. You smile and defer to counsel. The minute you try to defend yourself, you're playing their game. 45 minutes out, Chen's phone rang. He listened for 30 seconds, his expression darkening with each word, then hung up and turned to his team with barely controlled fury. Judge denied the motion to exclude, what? He said. Tessa's testimony stands, but the defense leaked grand jury witness list to the press. Our entire strategy just became public knowledge. Torres swore creatively. That's a violation of... I know what it violates. We'll file complaints, demand investigations. But right now we've got reporters calling grand jury witnesses asking for comments before they've even testified. Chen ran a hand through his hair, a crack in his professional composure. They're trying to intimidate witnesses into changing their stories or withdrawing entirely. Have any withdrawn? The general asked. 2 so far. Both nurses who worked with Crane, both suddenly remembering they might have misunderstood what they witnessed. Chen's jaw flexed. We still have enough for indictments, but every witness we lose weakens the case. Tessa felt the trap tightening around all of them. The defense wasn't just fighting in courtrooms. They were fighting in media, in public opinion, in the quiet conversations where witnesses decided whether testifying was worth the personal cost. What about the patients, she asked, the 22 people who were misdiagnosed? 13 have agreed to testify. 9 are still deciding. Chen met her eyes. They're scared. They've been blind their entire lives, told by authority figures that nothing could help them. Now we're asking them to stand in court and relive that trauma while defense attorneys question whether they're really victims or just opportunists chasing settlements. That's obscene. That's how the system protects itself. Chen checked his watch. 30 minutes. Everyone ready? They moved to the press conference location, a room filled with cameras and reporters who'd been waiting for federal comment on the biggest medical fraud case in years. Tessa stood between Chen and General Blackwood, feeling spotlights turn her into a specimen under examination. The room settled into to announce the findings of a federal investigation into systematic medical malpractice and fraud at Northridge Military Medical Center. He laid out the case with surgical precision. 22 confirmed patients misdiagnosed with permanent blindness, preliminary estimates suggesting over $3 million in fraudulent billing, evidence of administrative cover-ups dating back nearly a decade. The numbers landed like artillery shells, each one detonating across the room. The grand jury will convene tomorrow morning to consider criminal charges against Dr. Victor Crane, former chief of ophthalmology, and multiple hospital administrators who enabled and concealed this fraud. We anticipate indictments on charges including conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and medical battery. Medical battery. Tessa hadn't heard that term before, but Chen explained it meant causing physical harm through medical treatment that served no legitimate purpose. Keeping people blind to generate revenue qualified as harm. Then the general stepped forward, and the room's energy shifted from prosecutorial to personal. My daughter Avery was one of Dr. Crane's patients, he began, his voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of rage that made reporters lean forward. For 18 years, we were told her blindness was permanent. We accepted this because we trusted the medical establishment to tell us the truth. That trust was betrayed. He described the discovery, the surgery, the moment Avery saw light for the first time. His voice remained steady, but Tessa saw his hands grip the podium hard enough to whiten his knuckles. 22 families received the same betrayal. 22 people lived in preventable darkness because one doctor prioritized his reputation over their sight. This isn't a story about medical mistakes. This is a story about systematic abuse of power, and it stops today. Then he stepped aside, and Diana gave Tessa the subtle nod that meant her 90 seconds had arrived. Tessa moved to the podium, facing a wall of cameras and recorders, and felt her prepared remarks evaporate under the weight of actual human attention. She looked down at the note card, then made a decision that would probably give Diana a heart attack. She set the card aside. My name is Tessa Morgan. I'm a nurse at Northridge Medical Center. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 3 weeks ago, I was assigned to care for Avery Blackwood. I performed a routine eye examination and saw something that didn't match her chart, a thin membrane that looked treatable. When I reported this to the attending physician, I was told I was wrong, that I was creating false hope, and that I should stay in my lane. She paused, letting that sink in. But I kept looking, because that's what nurses do. We look at patients and see possibilities instead of limitations. And what I found was that Avery's blindness wasn't permanent. It was preventable, treatable, fixable. Tessa's voice hardened. And when I discovered that 21 other people had been given the same wrong diagnosis, I realized this wasn't about one doctor making mistakes. This was about a system that punishes people for telling the truth. She'd gone over her 90 seconds, violated the script, probably created sound bites the defense would weaponize. But the room had gone absolutely silent, and Tessa saw some reporters actually setting down their phones to listen. "I'm not a hero. I'm a nurse who did her job, but I'm standing here because too many people in healthcare have learned to stay quiet, to accept authority without question, to be invisible when being visible might cause problems." She met the cameras directly. "That stops today, because those 22 people deserve better. And every patient in every hospital deserves nurses who will look at them and refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable." She stepped back. Diana looked simultaneously horrified and impressed. Chen gave her a subtle nod that suggested she'd either destroyed everything or made his case stronger, probably both. The questions came like machine gun fire. "Miss Morgan, are you under investigation for HIPAA violations?" Chen stepped forward. "That investigation is retaliatory and baseless." Next question. "General Blackwood, will you be suing the hospital?" "The focus right now is criminal prosecution. Civil litigation can wait until after these people are held criminally accountable." "How many more misdiagnosed patients do you expect to find?" Chen fielded that one too, explaining the ongoing review of Crane's entire patient history, the independent examinations being conducted, the possibility that the final count could exceed 50. 50 people. 50 lives stolen. The number made Tessa dizzy. The press conference ended after 20 minutes, but the aftershocks continued for hours. Video clips circulated across social media, Tessa's unscripted remarks being shared thousands of times with commentary ranging from supportive to viciously critical. Medical professionals debated whether she'd overstepped. Patient advocacy groups hailed her as exactly the kind of nurse healthcare needed, and the defense attorneys began crafting responses that would paint her as a reckless amateur playing hero. Chen pulled her aside while his team handled follow-up media requests. "That was either brilliant or catastrophic. We'll know which when we see how the grand jury responds." "I'm sorry I went off script." "Don't apologize. You gave them something they couldn't get from legal briefings. Humanity. The question is whether the defense can use that humanity against you." He checked his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be real-time social media analysis. "Public opinion is running 70-30 in your favor. That's good. But juries don't always track with public opinion." Tessa spent the evening in a hotel room the prosecutor's office had arranged, away from her apartment and the reporters who'd inevitably found her address. Torres stayed with her, reviewing grand jury procedures and potential defense strategies, while Tessa tried to eat takeout that tasted like cardboard. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., you testify before 23 grand jurors," Torres explained. "No defense attorneys present, just you, Chen, and the jurors deciding whether there's probable cause for indictments. It should be straightforward." "Should be?" "Grand juries indict 99% of the time, but this case is high-profile enough that the defense might have people trying to influence jurors, media running counter-narratives, anything to create doubt." Torres set down her own barely touched food. "And Tessa? Once you testify, you're locked in. Every word becomes sworn testimony that can be used against you if it contradicts anything you say later." "I'm telling the truth. Truth doesn't contradict itself. Memory does. Perception does. Under skilled cross-examination, even honest people start second-guessing what they saw." Torres's expression softened. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to prepare you for how brutal this gets." Tessa slept badly, her dreams filled with courtrooms and cameras and blind people accusing her of false hope. She woke at 5, gave up on sleep by 5:30, and spent 2 hours reviewing her own documentation until the words blurred together. Chen collected her at 8:15, arriving with coffee and the kind of focused calm that came from having done this hundreds of times. They drove to the courthouse in silence, the city waking up around them, unaware that today would probably determine whether powerful people faced consequences or walked away untouched. The grand jury room was smaller than Tessa expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom. 23 jurors sat in tiered seating, their faces showing the kind of civic duty exhaustion that came from being pulled away from normal life to decide weighty questions. Chen made brief introductions, explaining Tessa's role in the case, then stepped back. "Miss Morgan, please describe in your own words what led you to examine Avery Blackwood's eyes." Tessa took a breath and began. She walked them through her assignment to Avery's care, the notation in the chart about permanent blindness, the conversation with Avery that had sparked her curiosity. She described the examination, the membrane she'd observed, her attempt to report to Dr. Crane. "And what was Dr. Crane's response?" Chen prompted. "He told me I was wrong, that I was unqualified to make diagnostic assessments, that I was creating false hope and should stay in my lane." Tessa met the juror's eyes. "He threatened to have me fired if I continued questioning his diagnosis." "Did you continue?" "Yes, because what I saw was real, and Avery deserved someone who believed her condition might be treatable." Chen walked her through the subsequent events: the general's intervention, the re-examination, the discovery that Crane had noted membrane opacity years earlier but dismissed it. Then he introduced documentation, chart notes, examination photos, expert opinions from independent specialists. "Miss Morgan, in your professional opinion, was the membrane obstruction visible in a standard ophthalmological examination?" Tessa thought carefully before answering. "I'm not qualified to speak to ophthalmological standards, but in a basic nursing assessment using standard equipment, yes, the membrane was visible. And yet Dr. Crane missed it in over 100 examinations. Or he saw it and chose not to acknowledge it." One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, raised her hand. "Can I ask a question?" Chen nodded. "Please. Miss Morgan, you said you'd only been working at that hospital for 6 weeks. What made you think you could see something that specialists missed?" The question cut straight to the defense's future strategy. Tessa met the woman's eyes. "I didn't think I could see something they missed. I thought I saw something worth investigating. There's a difference between claiming you're smarter than everyone else and refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable just because authority figures say so." Another juror spoke up, older man, skeptical expression. "But you're a nurse. Don't doctors have more training, more expertise?" "In medicine, yes, but nurses spend more time with patients. We see things doctors miss because we're there when doctors aren't." Tessa kept her voice level. "And sometimes fresh eyes see what experienced eyes have stopped looking for." The questioning continued for 90 minutes. Chen introduced evidence of the other misdiagnosed patients, the financial fraud, the administrative cover-up. He showed email chains where Crane had dismissed concerns from other medical professionals, billing records that demonstrated ongoing revenue from patients who could have been treated years earlier. Then he played his final card, a recorded statement from one of the other victims, a 30-year-old woman named Sarah Kim, who'd been blind since childhood and had just undergone successful surgery to remove the same membrane obstruction Tessa had identified in Avery. "I trusted them," Sarah's voice came through the courtroom speakers, raw with betrayal. "I spent 27 years learning to navigate a world without sight because doctors told me nothing could be done. And the whole time, it could have been fixed with one surgery. They stole my childhood, my education, relationships I never had because I thought I'd always be a burden, all of it preventable." The recording ended. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. Chen let the silence stretch before delivering his conclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about one nurse being right or one doctor being wrong. This is about systematic fraud enabled by institutional corruption. The evidence is overwhelming. The victims are real, and the defendants need to be held accountable." He dismissed Tessa, and she waited in a side room while the grand jury deliberated. Torres sat with her, both of them avoiding conversation because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like wishful thinking. 47 minutes later, Chen emerged with an expression of grim satisfaction. "True bill on all counts. Indictments issued for Crane, Margaret Voss, and 3 other administrators. Arrest warrants go out within the hour." Tessa felt something unclench in her chest. They're actually going to face charges. They're going to face trial. Whether they face consequences depends on what happens in court. Chen's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his satisfaction turned to concern. Crane's attorney just released a statement. They're claiming he's being scapegoated for systemic failures beyond his control and that he's willing to testify against hospital administration in exchange for reduced charges. Torres swore. He's going to flip. Probably. Which means the real trial becomes whether the hospital administrators knew about the fraud or whether Crane was a rogue actor they couldn't control. Chen looked at Tessa. Either way, you're going to be called to testify about who knew what and when. This just got more complicated. They left the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding media that had gathered at the front. But news traveled fast. By the time Tessa reached the hotel, her phone was flooded with messages. Some supportive, some threatening, all of them treating her like public property, whose every action warranted commentary. One message stood out. Unknown number, but the content made her hands shake. Congratulations. You just destroyed a lot of lives. Hope you can live with the consequences. She showed it to Torres, who immediately contacted courthouse security and Chen's office. Within an hour, Tessa had a protective detail. 2 U.S. Marshals who would shadow her until the trial concluded or the threats were deemed no longer credible. This is insane, Tessa said, watching the Marshals coordinate with hotel security. I'm a nurse. I'm not supposed to need bodyguards. You're a federal witness in a case involving millions of dollars and powerful reputations, one of the Marshals replied. People have been killed for less. The reality of that statement settled over her like ice water. She'd thought the threats were just intimidation, corporate warfare conducted through lawyers and PR firms. But if someone was desperate enough, violence became another tool in their arsenal. She spent the next 3 days in protective custody, watching from a distance as the arrests happened. Dr. Crane was taken into custody at his home, footage of him in handcuffs becoming instant news cycle gold. Margaret Voss surrendered through her attorney, maintaining dignified silence while reporters shouted questions. The 3 other administrators were processed through the system with varying degrees of public breakdown. And at Northridge Medical Center, the institutional chaos reached critical mass. The board of directors held emergency meetings. Major donors threatened to withdraw funding. Patients filed civil suits at a rate that suggested the hospital might not survive the legal onslaught. Torres kept Tessa updated through daily calls that felt like battlefield reports from a war she'd accidentally started. Crane's attorney is in plea negotiations, Torres reported on day 4. They're offering his full testimony against hospital administration in exchange for dropping the medical battery charges and reducing fraud charges to misdemeanors. That's not justice, Tessa said. That's the system. Prosecutors take the plea that guarantees convictions at higher levels. Crane might walk with probation, but his testimony could put Voss and the administrators away for decades. What about his medical license? State Medical Board has separate proceedings. He'll lose the license regardless of criminal outcome. But yeah, it's not perfect justice. Tessa stared out the hotel window at a city that had no idea one of its major hospitals was imploding. When do I testify again? Preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. That's where the defense gets their first shot at cross-examination. Chen's team will prep you, but Tessa, this is where it gets brutal. They're going to attack everything. Your competence, your motivations, your employment history. Anything that makes you look unreliable or vindictive. I've got nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide. The question is whether they find it. The preliminary hearing arrived with the inevitability of execution dawn. Tessa wore a conservative suit that Torres had purchased specifically for court appearances, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup, everything calculated to project competent professionalism. The courtroom was packed with media, victim families, and enough lawyers to populate a small firm. Judge Sarah Martinez presided with the no-nonsense authority of someone who'd seen every courtroom trick and had patience for none of them. She gavelled the room to order and got straight to business. We're here for preliminary hearing in the matter of United States versus Victor Crane and others. Is the government ready? Chen stood. Ready, Your Honor. Defense? A man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Tessa's car rose with practiced grace. Lawrence Hutchins for Dr. Crane, ready. 2 other attorneys introduced themselves for the hospital administrators, their credentials suggesting Northridge had emptied its legal war chest to mount this defense. Chen called Tessa as his first witness. She took the stand, raised her hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the witness chair while Hutchins studied her like a predator assessing prey. Chen walked her through the same testimony she'd given the grand jury, her examination of Avery, her observation, Crane's dismissal. The story had become almost rehearsed through repetition, but Tessa kept it grounded in specifics, in the reality of what she'd seen and done. Then Chen yielded to cross-examination, and Lawrence Hutchins rose with the confidence of someone who'd destroyed witnesses before. Miss Morgan, you testified that you've worked at 4 different hospitals in 3 years. Is that correct? Yes. Why so many moves? I was looking for the right fit. Or you couldn't hold a job? Hutchins smiled like they were having a friendly conversation. Your employment record shows terminations from 2 of those facilities. I resigned from 1. The other was a contract position that ended naturally. But you were let go from Harbor General after 18 months, weren't you? Torres had warned her this was coming. I was part of a larger restructuring. Multiple nurses were let go. After you filed complaints about a senior physician's prescribing practices? Chen stood. Objection, relevance. Goes to pattern of behavior, Your Honor, Hutchins countered. The witness has a history of questioning physician authority. Judge Martinez considered. I'll allow it, but make your point quickly, counsel. Hutchins turned back to Tessa. You filed complaints about Dr. Richard Morrison at Harbor General, didn't you? I reported observations about prescription patterns that concerned me. And those observations were investigated and found to be baseless, weren't they? Tessa felt the trap closing. The investigation concluded there was no evidence of intentional wrongdoing. So you were wrong. I reported what I saw. The investigation determined it was documentation errors rather than prescription fraud. But you accused a respected physician of criminal behavior based on incomplete information? I reported concerns through proper channels, just like you reported concerns about Dr. Crane. Hutchins moved closer, his voice taking on an edge. Tell me, Miss Morgan, do you have a problem with authority figures? Chen objected. The judge sustained, but the damage was done. Hutchins had planted the seed that Tessa was a habitual troublemaker who saw conspiracies where none existed. The cross-examination continued for 3 hours. Hutchins dissected every decision Tessa had made, questioned every observation, implied that her medical school rejections had created resentment toward successful physicians. He was surgical in his destruction, never overtly hostile but constantly suggesting incompetence through careful phrasing. You testified that the membrane was visible in a basic nursing assessment, correct? Yes. But you're not an ophthalmologist, are you? No. Never trained in advanced ocular examination? I've had standard nursing training in ophthalmological assessment. Standard nursing training, not specialist training. Hutchins let that hang. So when you claim this membrane was visible, you're basing that on what exactly? 6 weeks of probationary employment and some vague memory of your mother treating a patient 20 years ago? I'm basing it on what I observed with standard medical equipment, and what was later confirmed by 3 independent specialists. Specialists who were called in after you'd already created a narrative about malpractice. They were looking for what you told them to find. They were looking for the truth. Or they were supporting a conclusion that justified federal intervention and guaranteed media attention. Hutchins returned to his table, retrieved a document. Miss Morgan, have you been contacted by any media outlets about book deals or movie rights regarding this case? Tessa blinked, thrown by the pivot. Yes, but I declined all of them. But you were offered substantial sums. I was offered money to tell my story. I said no. Because you knew accepting would make you look financially motivated? Chen objected. Sustained. But again, the implication lingered. That Tessa was calculating enough to refuse money now while building a narrative that would pay off later. When Hutchins finally finished, Tessa felt hollowed out, every certainty questioned, every action reframed as something suspicious. She stepped down from the witness stand on trembling legs, avoiding eye contact with the gallery, and took her seat beside Chen. You did well, he whispered. He landed some hits, but nothing fatal. The preliminary hearing continued with other witnesses. Dr. Patterson testifying about the membrane's visibility, hospital administrators deflecting blame, financial experts explaining the fraud's scope. By the end of day 3, Judge Martinez had heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, I find probable cause to proceed to trial on all counts. Defendants will remain released on bond with travel restrictions. Trial date set for 8 weeks from today. She gavelled the proceedings closed. 8 weeks. 2 months to prepare for a trial that would determine whether speaking up had been heroism or career-ending recklessness. Tessa left the courthouse through the back entrance, flanked by U.S. Marshals, and climbed into an unmarked vehicle that would take her back to protective custody. Her phone buzzed with a message from Avery. "Watched your testimony online. You were amazing. They tried to break you and couldn't. We're all rooting for you." The support felt warm but distant, like encouragement shouted across a battlefield. Tessa typed a brief thanks and put the phone away, staring out at a city that had no idea how many lives were about to change based on whether a jury believed one nurse over an entire institution. That night, alone in another anonymous hotel room, Tessa's phone rang. Unknown number, but she'd stopped ignoring those. "Miss Morgan, this is Dr. Victor Crane." Tessa almost hung up. Almost. But something in his voice, defeat maybe, or desperation, made her hesitate. "I'm not supposed to be talking to you," she said. "I know, but I needed to say something before this goes any further." Crane's voice sounded nothing like the authoritative physician who dismissed her in the ICU. He sounded broken. "You were right. About the membrane. About everything." Tessa said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "I saw it years ago," Crane continued. "In Avery, in Sarah Kim, and at least 6 others. I saw it, and I convinced myself it was artifact, or I told myself one more test would confirm before I committed to surgery, or I just stopped looking because admitting I'd missed something meant admitting I'd failed." "You didn't just fail," Tessa said quietly. "You kept people blind." "I know." His voice cracked. "I know what I did, and I know taking a plea makes me a coward on top of everything else. But they're offering me a deal, and I'm going to take it because I can't survive a trial. I wanted you to know that I'm going to testify truthfully about what happened, about what I saw and didn't report, about the administrators who knew." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know that you were right to not stay quiet, that nurses like you are what healthcare needs even though the system tries to destroy you for it." He paused. "And because I'm sorry, for what that's worth, which is probably nothing." The line went dead. Tessa sat holding the phone, processing a confession that wouldn't change anything legally, but somehow shifted something internally. Crane had been a person before he'd become a defendant, a doctor who'd made catastrophic choices and then spent years defending them until the weight became unsustainable. She didn't forgive him, but she understood how institutional pressure could transform good intentions into systematic harm, how protecting reputation could become more important than protecting patients, how one wrong choice could metastasize into a career of them. The next morning, news broke that Dr. Crane had accepted a plea deal, misdemeanor fraud charges, no jail time, permanent loss of medical license, and full cooperation in the prosecution of hospital administrators. The public reaction was predictable outrage, but Chen seemed satisfied. "His testimony locks in the administrators," Chen explained during their next prep session. "Voss, Pemberton, the others, they can't claim ignorance now. Crane's going to testify they knew about the misdiagnoses and actively suppressed reports. So they go to prison and he walks free? He walks free legally, professionally, financially, personally. He's destroyed, lost his career, his reputation, probably his marriage. That's not nothing." Chen met her eyes. "I know it's not perfect justice, but it's the justice we can actually achieve." The weeks crawled toward trial with bureaucratic inevitability. Tessa spent her days in preparation, mock cross-examinations, evidence review, coaching on how to maintain composure under attack. Her nights were consumed by nightmares where she was back on the witness stand, unable to remember what she'd seen, while juries shook their heads in disappointment. 3 days before trial, Torres pulled her into an emergency meeting. "The defense just filed new evidence," Torres said, her expression grim. "They found your medical school application essays. You wrote about wanting to become a doctor because you watched your mother's clinic fail and wanted to understand why good medicine wasn't enough." Tessa remembered those essays, passionate, naive, full of idealism that had been crushed by rejection letters. "So what?" she asked. "So they're arguing you became a nurse because you failed to become a doctor, and this entire case is about you proving you're smarter than the physicians who rejected you. They're going to paint your whole career as revenge fantasy against the medical establishment." That's insane. That's defense strategy. They take your truth and twist it until it serves their narrative. Torres pulled up the court filing on her tablet. They're also bringing in a psychiatrist to testify about something called rescue fantasy syndrome, the idea that you have a pathological need to be seen as a hero, which drives you to create crises you can solve. Tessa felt laughter bubbling up, hysteria disguised as humor. I have a syndrome now? According to a psychiatrist who's never met you but has been paid $30,000 to review your employment records and develop a profile. Torres set down the tablet. This is what I warned you about. They're not fighting the evidence. They're fighting you. If they destroy your credibility, the evidence becomes irrelevant. Trial began on a Monday morning, cold enough to frost car windows and sharp enough to cut exposed skin. Tessa walked into the federal courthouse, flanked by marshals, past protesters holding signs both supporting and condemning her, through metal detectors and security checkpoints that felt like entering a war zone. The courtroom was larger than the preliminary hearing venue, designed for major trials with media attention and public significance. Every seat was filled, cameras in designated areas, sketch artists positioned for optimal sight lines. Judge Martinez took the bench and immediately established the rules. No outbursts, no disruptions. Everyone here served the pursuit of justice, whether they believed in it or not. Jury selection had happened the previous week, resulting in 12 people whose entire lives would now pause while they decided whether powerful people faced consequences. They looked ordinary, exhausted, burdened by civic duty they hadn't requested. Opening statements began with Chen laying out the government's case: systematic fraud, institutional cover-up, 22 victims who'd been betrayed by the medical establishment. He promised evidence, testimony, and documentation that would prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants had known about the malpractice and actively concealed it. Then Hutchins rose for the defense, and Tessa watched him transform the narrative with practiced skill. This case isn't about whether mistakes were made, he began, his voice reasonable and sympathetic. Mistakes were made. Dr. Crane has admitted as much. The question is whether these mistakes constituted criminal fraud, or whether they were tragic errors compounded by institutional complexity beyond any individual's control. He painted Crane as a dedicated physician overwhelmed by caseload, administrators as bureaucrats trying to navigate impossible medical legal landscapes, and the whole situation as a systemic failure rather than criminal conspiracy. And at the center of this prosecution's case is Nurse Tessa Morgan, a probationary employee with 6 weeks' experience who claimed she saw what dozens of specialists missed. A nurse who'd been fired from previous positions for questioning physician authority. A nurse who applied to medical school and was rejected, who wrote about her resentment toward the establishment that denied her dreams. Tessa felt every juror's eyes shift toward her. The prosecution will ask you to believe that this nurse, barely qualified to take blood pressure, somehow possessed insight that eluded trained ophthalmologists. They'll ask you to believe her observations over documented medical expertise. And they'll ask you to send people to prison based on the testimony of someone with a documented pattern of seeing conspiracies where none exist. Hutchins let that settle before continuing. We're not here to defend bad medicine. We're here to prevent good people from being destroyed because one ambitious nurse needed to be right more than she needed to be accurate. Keep that in mind as you hear the evidence. He sat down, and Tessa felt the weight of his words pressing down on the jury box. Chen had warned her the defense would attack her credibility, but hearing it delivered with such polished conviction made it feel true even to her own ears. The prosecution called its first witness, Dr. James Patterson, the Walter Reed ophthalmologist who'd confirmed Tessa's initial observation. He testified about the membrane's visibility, the straightforward nature of the surgical correction, the fact that any competent ophthalmologist should have identified it. Then Hutchins cross-examined, and Tessa watched Patterson's certainty get questioned into qualified uncertainty through hours of technical grilling about examination conditions, lighting variables, and the difference between visible and clinically significant findings. By the time Patterson stepped down, the jury looked confused rather than convinced. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Witness after witness, expert after expert, each one adding complexity to what should have been a simple story about medical negligence. The defense brought in their own ophthalmologists who testified that the membrane was subtle enough to miss, that Crane's diagnoses were within acceptable medical judgment, that hindsight made everything look obvious when it hadn't been at the time. Patient victims testified about their blindness, their surgeries, their recovery. But under cross-examination, Hutchins got several to admit they'd been approached by personal injury attorneys, that they stood to gain financially from civil suits, that their memories of conversations with Crane might not be entirely reliable after so many years. The evidence mounted on both sides: financial records showing suspicious billing patterns, email chains that could be read as either cover-up or legitimate medical caution, expert testimony that contradicted other expert testimony until truth felt like a matter of interpretation rather than fact. And through it all, Tessa waited for her turn on the stand, knowing the entire trial was building toward the moment when she'd have to defend not just her observations, but her entire existence against institutional forces that wanted her erased. On day 18 of the trial, Chen called Tessa Morgan to the stand. She walked to the witness box, feeling every eye in the courtroom track her movement. She swore the oath, settled into the chair, and looked directly at the jury, 12 strangers who would decide whether her truth was trustworthy. Chen walked her through the familiar testimony one more time, letting her tell the story in her own words without interruption. Tessa spoke clearly, without embellishment, sticking to facts she could document and observations she'd recorded. She described examining Avery, seeing the membrane, attempting to report to Crane, being threatened with termination. And Miss Morgan, when Dr. Crane told you to stay in your lane, what did you do? I kept looking, because Avery deserved someone who wouldn't give up on her. Why you? Why did it have to be you instead of trusting the specialists? Tessa considered the question carefully. It didn't have to be me. It should have been any of the dozens of doctors who'd examined her over 18 years. But it wasn't. So it was me. Or it was no one. Chen nodded and yielded to cross-examination. Lawrence Hutchins approached with the predatory grace of someone who'd spent 3 weeks preparing to destroy her. Miss Morgan, you've testified that you saw a membrane in Avery Blackwood's eyes during a basic nursing assessment, but you're not an ophthalmologist, correct? Correct? In fact, you failed to get into medical school, didn't you? I wasn't accepted, yes. 5 different schools rejected your application? Yes. Because your test scores and grades weren't competitive enough? Chen objected. Judge Martinez allowed it. The rejection letters didn't specify reasons, Tessa said, but you applied to become a doctor and were rejected, so you became a nurse instead? I became a nurse because I wanted to help people. Medical school wasn't the only path to that goal. Or wasn't the path available to you? Hutchins pulled out documents. Your application essays talk extensively about wanting to change the system and challenge medical establishment thinking. Is that accurate? I wanted to improve healthcare, yes. By challenging doctors? By advocating for patients. Even when those doctors have decades more training and experience than you? Experience doesn't make you right. It just makes you experienced. A few jurors smiled. Hutchins noticed and shifted tactics. Miss Morgan, you've testified about this membrane being visible, but when Dr. Crane examined Avery Blackwood, he didn't see it. When Dr. Stevens examined her, he didn't see it. When Dr. Martinez examined her, she didn't see it. Are they all incompetent, or is it possible you saw something that wasn't actually there? It's possible they saw it and didn't recognize it as treatable. Or possible you imagined it because you wanted to be right? I photographed it. 3 independent specialists confirmed it. The surgeon removed it. It was real. After you'd already created a narrative about malpractice. Those specialists were looking for what you told them to find. They were looking with open eyes instead of closed minds. Hutchins paused, and Tessa realized she'd just said something he could weaponize. She saw it in his smile. Closed minds. Is that how you view doctors who disagree with you? As closed-minded? I view doctors who ignore evidence as closed-minded. Like Dr. Morrison at Harbor General, who you accused of prescription fraud before being fired? I was laid off during restructuring, not fired for reporting concerns. But you did accuse Dr. Morrison of criminal behavior that was investigated and found baseless? I reported observations. The investigation concluded differently than I expected. So you were wrong. I was wrong about the cause, not wrong about reporting concerns. Just like you could be wrong about Dr. Crane's motivations while being right about finding a membrane. The trap had closed perfectly. Tessa felt it tightening. The membrane exists. Whether Dr. Crane missed it accidentally or deliberately, the result is the same. Avery was blind when she shouldn't have been. Hutchins moved closer, his voice dropping to conversational intimacy. Miss Morgan, isn't it true that you have a pattern of seeing conspiracies and cover-ups where simpler explanations exist? That you consistently question authority figures because you resent the medical establishment that rejected you? No. No. Then why have you worked at 4 hospitals in 3 years? Why were you let go from 2 positions? Why does your employment record show consistent notation about difficulty accepting authority? Because I prioritize patients over politics. Or because you can't accept that you're not as smart as the doctors who are actually qualified to make these determinations? Chen objected. Sustained. But the damage accumulated with each exchange. The cross-examination continued for 2 days. Hutchins dissected every decision Tessa had made, every observation, every moment where she'd chosen to question rather than accept. He brought in the psychiatrist who testified about rescue fantasy syndrome, about how some medical professionals develop pathological needs to be seen as heroes. Chen destroyed the psychiatrist on recross, getting him to admit he'd never actually met Tessa and had based his entire assessment on employment records provided by the defense. But the seed had been planted that Tessa was damaged, resentful, desperate to prove herself regardless of truth. By the time Tessa finally left the witness stand, she felt scraped raw, every certainty questioned until her own memories felt unreliable. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon heavy with exhaustion and anticipation. Chen delivered a methodical dismantling of the defense's case, pointing to financial records, email chains, and the undeniable fact that 22 people had been told they were permanently blind when they weren't. The defense wants you to believe this was all innocent mistakes and one nurse's vendetta, Chen said. But the evidence tells a different story. A story about doctors protecting reputations over patients, about administrators prioritizing profit over ethics, and about a system so corrupt that it took one probationary nurse to tear it down. Then Hutchins delivered his closing, and Tessa watched him weave doubt into every strand of evidence. The prosecution has shown you mistakes, but mistakes aren't crimes. They've shown you bad judgment, but bad judgment isn't fraud. What they haven't shown you is criminal intent, deliberate, knowing, willful fraud. He gestured toward Tessa. What they've shown you is a nurse with a grudge and a narrative that fits her need to be right. Don't send good people to prison based on the testimony of someone whose own employment record shows she sees conspiracies everywhere she works. The jury got the case at 4:30 on Friday afternoon. Judge Martinez instructed them on the law, defined reasonable doubt, and sent them to deliberate. Tessa waited in a witness room with Torres, Chen, and the U.S. Marshals who'd become familiar shadows. Minutes stretched into hours. 5 o'clock came and went. 6 o'clock. 7. At 8:15, the jury sent a note asking to review financial records. At 9:30, they requested Dr. Crane's plea agreement. At 11, they asked for clarification on the definition of conspiracy. Judge Martinez sent them to hotel rooms for the night and told everyone to return Monday morning. The weekend passed in surreal suspension. Tessa stayed in her hotel room, avoiding news coverage that analyzed every moment of the trial, ignoring social media where strangers debated her credibility. She'd done everything she could. Now 12 strangers would decide whether it had been enough. Monday morning brought a cold rain that matched Tessa's mood. The courtroom filled with the same crowd that had been there for 3 weeks. Everyone knowing this was endgame. The jury deliberated for 7 more hours. At 3:45 Monday afternoon, they sent word they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in. Tessa tried to read their faces and found nothing. Professional neutrality cultivated over 3 weeks of trial. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged man who'd asked thoughtful questions during selection, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez gavelled for order while Tessa felt something release in her chest. Validation, maybe? Or just the end of uncertainty? The verdicts continued. Guilty on fraud charges, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on charges Tessa barely understood, but that added up to years in prison for people who'd thought they were untouchable. Margaret Voss collapsed into her attorney's arms. Sandra Pemberton stared straight ahead like she'd stopped processing reality. The other administrators showed varying degrees of breakdown, while their attorneys immediately filed for appeal, but the verdict stood: guilty. Across the board, 22 patients vindicated, 1 nurse's observations validated. Tessa walked out of that courtroom flanked by U.S. Marshals, past reporters shouting questions, through crowds that either cheered or jeered depending on their perspective. She climbed into the SUV and sat in silence while the city blurred past. Her phone buzzed. Text from Avery. "They believed you. Thank you for refusing to give up." Another from General Blackwood. "Justice served. You did this." One from Torres. "You survived. That's victory enough." And one from an unknown number that made Tessa's blood run cold. "The trial's over. Now comes the real punishment. You should have stayed invisible." The threat arrived just as Tessa thought she'd won, a reminder that justice in courtrooms didn't guarantee safety outside them. She forwarded it to the marshals, to Chen, to everyone who needed to know that someone out there still thought she deserved consequences for telling the truth. The SUV pulled up to Tessa's hotel, and she climbed out into rain that felt like the city weeping. She'd won. The defendants would appeal, but she'd won. 22 people would get their sight back. The system had been exposed, and somewhere in the darkness, someone was already planning to make sure her victory felt like defeat. Tessa walked into the hotel lobby, past security that had become normal, toward elevators that would take her to another anonymous room. Her hands were shaking as she pressed the button, as the doors closed, as she rode up through floors that all looked the same. The elevator doors opened on her floor, and Tessa stepped out to find someone waiting outside her room. Dr. Victor Crane stood in the hallway, looking nothing like the distinguished physician who'd dismissed her in the ICU. He looked broken, hollowed out, destroyed by consequences that had finally caught up. "I needed to see you," he said quietly. "One last time before—" He gestured vaguely at a future that now included professional ruin and public shame. "I testified, I told the truth, and they still got convicted. So maybe you were right. Maybe the system was corrupt enough that even truth couldn't save them." Tessa stood frozen, unsure whether to run or listen. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Crane continued. "I'm just asking you to understand. I saw that membrane years ago. I convinced myself it wasn't significant, then convinced myself I'd been right to dismiss it, then spent years defending that decision until I couldn't remember what the truth had been." His voice broke. "I destroyed lives because I was too afraid to admit I'd made a mistake, and now my life is destroyed too. That's justice, I suppose." "What do you want from me?" Tessa asked. "Nothing. I just wanted you to know that you were right, about everything, about the membrane, about the cover-up, about nurses needing to speak up even when doctors try to silence them." He took a step back. "I hope you survive what comes next, because they're going to come after you, the people who lost today, and they'll be more dangerous than I ever was." He walked away before Tessa could respond, disappearing into the elevator like a ghost of institutional failure made flesh. Tessa unlocked her hotel room door with trembling hands and stepped inside to find it exactly as she'd left it, sterile, temporary, offering no comfort beyond basic shelter. She sat on the bed, still wearing her court clothes, and pulled out her phone. One new email, from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line, "Congratulations on your victory. Here's what it cost you." Tessa opened it against every instinct screaming not to. Inside was a single attachment, a photograph of her apartment, her actual apartment she hadn't seen in weeks. The door was intact, the windows unbroken, but written across the wall in paint that looked disturbingly like blood were 3 words. Tessa forwarded the photograph to the U.S. Marshals before her hand stopped shaking. Within 7 minutes, her hotel room door received 3 sharp knocks that carried the weight of federal authority responding to credible threats. Marshal Davies entered first, his partner Ellis sweeping the room with practiced efficiency, while Tessa sat on the bed still holding her phone like evidence at a crime scene. "We're moving you," Davies said, no preamble or reassurance, just tactical necessity. "Different hotel, different protocol. This leak means someone inside the security detail or prosecutor's office knows your location." The implication landed like a physical blow. Tessa had spent weeks trusting the system to protect her while she dismantled institutional corruption. And now that same system might be compromised by people who thought threats were acceptable responses to courtroom losses. "Who has access to my location?" she asked. "Too many people. Chen's team, courthouse security, hotel management, our own office." Davies was already packing her belongings with military precision. "We'll lock it down, run background checks, find the leak. But right now, priority is getting you somewhere safer." They moved through the hotel's service corridors like fugitives, exiting through loading docks where an unmarked vehicle waited with engine running. Tessa climbed in beside Ellis while Davies took the wheel, and they disappeared into city traffic that had no idea one of its vehicles carried someone whose testimony had just destroyed powerful careers. The new location turned out to be a federal safe house on the outskirts of the city, nondescript suburban home that could have belonged to any middle-class family, except for the reinforced doors and surveillance cameras covering every approach. Davies swept the interior while Ellis established a security perimeter, their efficiency suggesting this wasn't their first witness relocation under threat conditions. "You'll stay here until we identify who sent that photo," Davies explained, setting down Tessa's hastily packed belongings. "No visitors without prior authorization, no leaving the premises, no social media, no public communication of any kind." "For how long?" "However long it takes." Tessa sank onto the safe house couch, feeling the walls of her carefully reconstructed life collapse inward. She'd survived the trial, won the verdict, done everything right, and her reward was protective custody in a house that felt like a comfortable prison. Her phone buzzed. Torres calling from a number Tessa recognized as the attorney's personal line rather than office. "Are you safe?" Torres asked without greeting. "Define safe." "I'm in a federal safe house with armed guards because someone knows where I sleep. Chen's office is going insane. They're running counterintelligence protocols, interviewing everyone with access to witness protection details." "But Tessa," Torres's voice dropped. "This might not be about the trial. We've received information that suggests the threat is coming from outside the defendants." "Outside? Who else wants me scared?" "Medical defense organizations, professional liability insurers, groups that stand to lose billions if your case becomes precedent for nurses challenging physician authority." Torres paused, and Tessa heard papers shuffling. "We're seeing coordinated campaigns to discredit you across medical forums, social media, professional networks. Someone's spending serious money to make sure your victory looks like dangerous precedent rather than justice." The scope made Tessa dizzy. She'd thought defeating Crane and the hospital administrators was endgame, but they were just proxies for larger institutional forces that viewed one nurse's observations as existential threat to medical hierarchy. "So what do I do?" Tessa asked. "You survive. You let Chen's team handle the criminal investigation into the threats. And you start thinking about what comes after, because Tessa, you can't go back to Northridge. Even if they wanted you, which they don't, you'd be a target for every doctor and administrator who sees you as a cautionary tale. Then where do I go?" "Wherever nurses are needed who refuse to stay quiet, which is everywhere." The call ended, leaving Tessa alone in a safe house that felt less like protection and more like exile. She spent the evening reviewing news coverage of the verdict, reactions ranging from celebration to outrage, medical professionals debating whether she'd helped patients or destroyed necessary hierarchy, patient advocacy groups already citing her case in demands for systemic reform. Her name had become shorthand for a debate larger than any individual, whether healthcare worked better with rigid authority structures or whether questioning those structures was essential to actual care. She'd never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to help one blind girl see. Around midnight, Davies received a call that made his expression shift from watchful to alarmed. He stepped outside for privacy, but Tessa heard fragments through the door. Words like jurisdiction and federal charges and move her again. He returned with news that confirmed Tessa's worst suspicions. The vandalism at your apartment wasn't random threat. Forensics found evidence of professional execution. No prints, no DNA, surveillance footage wiped from building servers. Whoever did this has resources and training. Davies sat across from her, his professional mask slipping enough to show genuine concern. Chen's office is treating this as witness intimidation with possible organized crime connections. That changes the protection level. Organized crime? Over a medical malpractice case? Over hundreds of millions in potential liability. Your testimony doesn't just affect Northridge, it affects every hospital defending against malpractice claims, every insurance company calculating risk, every medical board deciding how to discipline members. You became a billion-dollar problem, and some people solve those problems with violence. The clinical assessment of her value as a target should have been terrifying, but Tessa felt something else entirely. Rage at a system so corrupt that speaking truth made you eligible for elimination. "I'm not hiding," she said. "You don't have a choice. Federal witness protection isn't optional when—" "I didn't say I'd stop cooperating. I said I'm not hiding." Tessa stood, pacing the small living room with energy that had nowhere productive to go. "They want me scared into silence? They want me invisible? Then I'm going to be so visible they can't make me disappear without everyone noticing." Davies studied her like she'd suggested something tactically insane. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we use their strategy against them. They're spending money to discredit me? I'll spend credibility to expose them. They want to make me a cautionary tale? I'll make myself a case study in what happens when you refuse to be cautioned. That's not protection. That's painting a bigger target. It's survival through visibility. They can threaten someone in hiding. They can't disappear someone the entire country is watching." Davies looked at Ellis, some silent communication passing between them. Then he pulled out his phone and called Chen, putting it on speaker when the prosecutor answered. "Your witness wants to go public," Davies said. "Full media offensive. Interviews, advocacy work, everything that makes her impossible to silence quietly." Chen was silent for long enough that Tessa thought the call had dropped. Then, "That's either brilliant or suicidal. Possibly both. Let me make some calls." The calls resulted in an emergency strategy session the next morning, held in the safe house's dining room that transformed into a war room when Torres arrived with her team. Chen brought federal resources, and General Blackwood showed up with military precision that suggested he'd been planning something similar. "Here's the situation," Chen began, spreading documents across the table like battle plans. "We have credible threats against Miss Morgan from sources with professional capability. We have ongoing criminal investigation into who's funding the intimidation campaign, and we have a verdict that's already inspiring copycat cases across 3 states." He pulled up a map showing hospitals facing similar lawsuits, nurses reporting observations, patients discovering preventable conditions, medical boards scrambling to contain the precedent Tessa's case had set. "You're not just one witness anymore," Chen continued. "You're the catalyst for a nationwide reckoning with how healthcare treats nursing observations, which makes you valuable to some people and dangerous to others." "So we leverage the valuable part," Torres said. "Media campaign positioning Tessa as a patient safety advocate. Speaking engagements, interviews, maybe a partnership with a national nursing organization. Make her too visible to threaten quietly. And too valuable to the movement to become a martyr," the general added, "because right now harming her would create exactly the kind of publicity these institutions are trying to avoid." Tessa listened to them plan her visibility like a military operation, equal parts grateful and overwhelmed. "What about Northridge? They're not going to let me just walk back into my job after I helped convict their executives." "Northridge filed for bankruptcy protection this morning," Chen said. "The civil suits from the 22 victims, combined with criminal penalties and loss of military contracts, means the hospital probably won't survive the year. Your job there is gone regardless." The news should have felt like victory, but instead Tessa felt something closer to grief. Northridge had been corrupt, but it had also been home to nurses who'd tried to do good work within a broken system. Now those nurses would be job hunting while their employer's corpse was picked apart by bankruptcy courts. "What happens to the patients?" Tessa asked. "Other hospitals will absorb most of them. Some programs might shut down. It's going to be messy." Chen met her eyes. "But that's not your responsibility. You reported malpractice. What the institution does with that information is on them." General Blackwood leaned forward. "I have contacts at Walter Reed and 3 other military medical facilities. They're all interested in hiring nurses with your particular skill set, people who prioritize patients over politics. You could have your pick of positions. With the understanding that you'd be monitored, protected, and basically living under federal supervision for the foreseeable future," Davies added, "the threat level doesn't disappear just because you change employers." Tessa absorbed the offers, the warnings, the carefully constructed future being built around her need for safety and the movement's need for her continued relevance. But beneath all the strategic planning, one question burned hotter than the rest. "Who sent the threat?" she asked. "Who actually vandalized my apartment and leaked my location?" Chen's expression darkened. "We're close to identifying the source. The forensic accountants found payments from a medical defense fund to a private security contractor with questionable legal history. We're executing search warrants today. And when you find them, we prosecute for witness intimidation, conspiracy, whatever charges stick. But Tessa, finding the individual who made the threat doesn't eliminate the institutional forces that funded it. There will always be someone else, some other group that views you as a problem worth solving. Then I'd better get used to being a problem." The statement landed with finality that shifted the room's energy from protective to tactical. They weren't hiding a vulnerable witness anymore. They were weaponizing a symbol. The media campaign launched 48 hours later with a carefully orchestrated interview on national news. Tessa sitting across from a journalist known for serious investigations rather than sensationalism. She'd spent 2 days in media training, learning how to deliver sound bites that couldn't be easily twisted, how to maintain composure under hostile questioning, how to be visible without being vulnerable. The interview opened with the verdict, but quickly pivoted to larger questions about healthcare hierarchy, nursing autonomy, and whether speaking up should require this much courage. "You've been threatened, relocated, and essentially forced into hiding because you reported a treatable condition," the journalist said. "What does that say about our medical system?" Tessa had practiced this answer, but she delivered it with genuine conviction. "It says we've built a system that protects reputation over patience, that punishes honesty and rewards silence. And that needs to change, because every day that system stays in place, people suffer unnecessarily. Some physicians argue that you overstepped, that nurses questioning specialist diagnoses undermines medical authority and creates chaos. I'd argue that blind obedience to authority is what created chaos. 22 people were unnecessarily blind because everyone was too afraid to question Dr. Crane's expertise." Tessa leaned forward slightly, the way Torres had coached her to do when making critical points. "Medical authority should be earned through accuracy, not demanded through hierarchy. You're aware there's a coordinated campaign to discredit you? Medical defense organizations calling you a dangerous precedent, liability insurers warning about frivolous challenges to physician judgment. I'm aware that institutions protecting billion-dollar interests don't like being held accountable, but I'm also aware that patient advocacy groups are using this case to demand better mechanisms for reporting concerns, that nursing organizations are revising protocols to protect staff who speak up, that medical boards are reviewing how they handle complaints about senior physicians." Tessa held the camera's gaze. "So yes, I'm dangerous to systems built on silence. That's exactly the point." The interview went viral within hours. Clips circulated across social media with commentary ranging from supportive to viciously critical. Medical forums debated her competence. Nursing organizations invited her to speak. And somewhere in the institutional machinery she'd exposed, people recalculated the cost of threatening someone who'd just become a national conversation. Chen called that evening with news. "We've identified the security contractor who vandalized your apartment, former military, now working private sector for a company that specializes in reputation management for healthcare institutions. He's cooperating in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony ties the intimidation campaign directly to a coalition of medical defense funds. Can you prosecute them? We're building a case. But these organizations are sophisticated, layers of shell companies, plausible deniability built into every transaction. It'll take months to untangle." Chen paused. "But here's what matters. The publicity around your interview made continuing the intimidation campaign untenable. They can't threaten you now without looking exactly like the corrupt institutions you've exposed. So I'm safe? You're safer. There's a difference." Tessa accepted that qualified victory and prepared for what came next. The speaking invitations arrived in waves: nursing conferences, patient safety symposiums, medical ethics seminars. Torres helped her negotiate contracts that included security provisions and editorial control, ensuring Tessa's story couldn't be co-opted by organizations with agendas she didn't support. 3 weeks after the verdict, Tessa stood in front of 1,200 nurses at the National Healthcare Advocacy Conference, looking out at faces that reflected her own journey, exhaustion, determination, the quiet rage of people who'd learned to swallow observations that should have been shouted. "I didn't set out to change anything," Tessa began, her voice steady despite the enormous venue. "I just wanted to help one patient. But what I learned is that helping one patient required challenging an entire system. And that system fought back hard." She described the threats, the isolation, the coordinated campaign to discredit her. The audience sat in absolute silence, recognizing their own fears reflected in her experience. "They tried to make me invisible, and for most of my career, I let them. I learned to be quiet, to defer, to accept that my observations mattered less than physician authority." Tessa's voice hardened. "But invisibility is complicity. Silence is collaboration, and every time we choose safety over truth, patients pay the price." The applause started before she finished, building into a standing ovation that felt less like celebration and more like collective release. 1,200 nurses acknowledging that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking. After the conference, a young nurse approached Tessa with trembling hands and desperate eyes. "I work in a cardiac unit," she said quietly. "There's a cardiologist who keeps dismissing my observations about irregular rhythms. 2 patients have coded on his watch in the last month. I've reported it through proper channels, but nothing changes." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what to do." Tessa took her hands, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with visibility. "Document everything. Exact times, specific observations, every attempt you make to report concerns. Build a record so detailed they can't dismiss it." "What if I get fired?" "You might, but those patients might die if you stay quiet." Tessa squeezed her hands. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you're not alone anymore. There are organizations now, legal resources, networks of nurses who've been through this. We protect each other." She provided contact information for patient advocacy groups, attorneys specializing in healthcare whistleblower cases, nursing organizations that offered support for staff facing retaliation. The young nurse left with something that looked like hope, and Tessa felt the purpose she'd been searching for crystallize into something concrete. She couldn't go back to bedside nursing, not with the security concerns and the target her visibility had created, but she could build systems that protected nurses who were still at the bedside, still making those critical observations, still choosing patients over politics. 2 months after the verdict, Tessa sat in a conference room at the National Nursing Alliance headquarters, surrounded by leaders who'd built careers advocating for healthcare reform. They'd invited her to join their board to help develop protocols that would protect nurses making observations that contradicted physician authority. "What we need," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Alliance president, "is a standardized system for reporting and escalating clinical concerns without fear of retaliation, something that creates paper trails, involves multiple levels of review, and has teeth when hospitals ignore legitimate observations." Tessa reviewed the proposed framework, recognizing her own experience in every safeguard they'd designed. Mandatory investigation timelines, third-party review boards, financial penalties for institutions that retaliated against reporting staff, legal support funds for nurses facing disciplinary action. "This would have saved me months of hell," Tessa said quietly. "If these protections had existed, I could have reported my observation without risking my career." "Exactly. And you're the reason we can push for these changes now. Your case gave us the leverage to demand institutional reform." Martinez leaned forward. "But we need you involved in designing this. You understand what frontline nurses face in ways policy experts never will." Tessa agreed and spent the next 3 months helping craft what would become the Patient Safety Observation Protocol, a comprehensive framework for how healthcare institutions should handle staff concerns about potential medical errors. The work was tedious, bureaucratic, nothing like the immediate satisfaction of patient care, but it was building something that would outlast any individual case. The protocol launched with support from 3 major nursing organizations and endorsement from patient advocacy groups across the country. Within 6 months, 12 states had introduced legislation requiring hospitals to implement similar systems. The institutional resistance was fierce, but the public pressure was fiercer, especially after Tessa testified before congressional committees about the need for structural change. She'd become something she never intended, a professional advocate, a symbol, a person whose value came from what she represented rather than what she directly provided. It felt strange, occasionally hollow, but undeniably impactful. 4 months after the verdict, sentencing happened for the convicted administrators. Tessa attended, sitting in the gallery beside victims who'd regained their sight and families still processing the betrayal. Margaret Voss received 8 years federal prison. Sandra Pemberton got 6. The other administrators received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, each one a public acknowledgement that institutional corruption carried consequences. Dr. Crane, who'd taken the plea deal and testified against his colleagues, received probation and permanent license revocation. He sat in the courtroom looking hollowed out, professionally dead, even if legally spared. Some victims shouted at him during the sentencing. Others just stared, their recovered vision allowing them to see the man who'd stolen years from them. Tessa felt no satisfaction watching them sentenced, just the grim recognition that punishment couldn't undo harm. 22 people had their sight restored, but they'd lost childhoods, educations, opportunities that no verdict could return. After sentencing, she met with the victim group in a courthouse conference room, answering their questions about the appeals process and helping connect them with civil attorneys who'd handle the financial compensation cases. Avery Blackwood was there, her vision now restored enough that she could see faces clearly. She crossed directly to Tessa and hugged her with the fierce gratitude of someone whose entire world had literally brightened. "I'm starting pre-med next semester," Avery said, "ophthalmology track. Because if this taught me anything, it's that patients need doctors who actually look." "You'll be an amazing physician," Tessa said. "I'll be a physician who listens to nurses." Avery smiled. "Because nurses like you see what doctors miss." Marcus Webb, the 10th victim Tessa had identified, approached with his mother beside him. He'd undergone surgery 3 weeks after Tessa's examination, and his vision had returned with the clarity of someone seeing the world for the first time at 26. "I'm writing a book," Marcus said, "about the experience of gaining sight as an adult, about adapting to visual input after living without it, about what it means to discover that suffering you'd accepted as permanent was actually preventable." "That sounds powerful." "It is, and you're in it." He smiled slightly. "The nurse who refused to accept my blindness as inevitable, the person who looked at me and saw possibility." Sarah Kim joined them, her own vision restored and her anger transformed into activism. She'd become a spokesperson for patient rights organizations, testifying at medical board hearings and pushing for reforms that would prevent similar negligence. "We're all doing something with this," Sarah said, gesturing at the gathered victims. "Some are going into medicine, some into advocacy. Some are just learning to see their kids' faces for the first time. But we're all here because you refused to stay quiet." Tessa looked around the room at 22 people whose lives had fundamentally changed because she'd trusted her observation over established authority. The weight of it, the responsibility, the impact, the terrifying reality that one decision had cascaded into all this made her chest tight. "I just did my job," she said quietly. "You did everyone's job," Sarah countered. "You did what every nurse, every doctor, every administrator should have done and didn't. That's not just doing your job. That's being the person the system needed, even when it tried to destroy you for it." 6 months after the verdict, Tessa received a letter from Northridge Medical Center, or what remained of it. The bankruptcy proceedings had concluded, the hospital had been sold to a national healthcare chain, and the new administration was implementing comprehensive reforms. They were renaming the patient safety program in her honor, the Morgan Protocol for Clinical Observation Reporting. The letter included an invitation to return for the dedication ceremony, to stand in the ICU where this had all started and speak about why the changes mattered. Tessa hadn't set foot in Northridge since the trial, and the thought of returning made her stomach clench with anxiety and something that might have been nostalgia. Torres accompanied her to the ceremony, along with Davies, who still provided security despite the threat level having decreased to normal background danger for public figures. They walked through the hospital's main entrance, renovated since the bankruptcy, rebranded with new signage that promised patient-centered care built on transparency and accountability. The ICU had changed too. New equipment, fresh paint, and a culture shift that was apparently tangible enough that Torres commented on it. "Staff actually look relaxed," Torres noted. "That's different from the war zone vibe this place had during the trial." The new hospital administrator, a woman named Dr. Rachel Foster, who'd built her reputation on turning around failing institutions, greeted Tessa with genuine warmth rather than corporate politeness. "Miss Morgan, thank you for coming. I know this hospital holds complicated memories for you." That's one way to describe it. "We've made significant changes since the acquisition. Mandatory training on observation reporting, anonymous ethics hotlines, third-party review boards for any disciplinary action involving patient safety concerns." Dr. Foster gestured at the ICU. "Your case gave us a blueprint for how not to run a medical center. We're trying to build something better." The dedication ceremony happened in the same corridor where Tessa had first defied Dr. Crane, where she'd been threatened with termination for questioning authority, where everything had started. A plaque now hung on the wall, the Morgan Protocol. In recognition that patient safety requires listening to all voices, especially those the system tries to silence. Tessa stood before an audience of hospital staff, some familiar faces who'd worked there during the scandal, many new hires brought in during the restructuring. She saw Diane Sutton in the third row, the charge nurse who'd once threatened her with reassignment. Sutton caught her eye and nodded with something that looked like respect. "I didn't want my name on a plaque," Tessa began. "I wanted a system that made plaques like this unnecessary. But if this protocol means the next nurse who sees something wrong doesn't face what I faced, then I'll accept the recognition." She talked about the importance of creating structures where observation could flow upward without fear, where questioning authority was seen as diligence rather than insubordination, where patient safety genuinely mattered more than institutional reputation. "This hospital failed its patients catastrophically," Tessa said, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. "But failure creates opportunity for change, if we're brave enough to actually change instead of just rebranding the same broken systems." After the ceremony, Patricia Hendricks approached, the senior nurse who'd once told Tessa to stay in her lane and accept how things worked. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said without preamble. "I spent 20 years teaching nurses to be quiet, and I told myself it was about maintaining order. But watching what you went through, seeing what happened when someone actually spoke up, I realized I was teaching complicity." "You were surviving," Tessa said. "I don't blame anyone for that. Maybe you should, because our survival came at patients' expense." Patricia's expression hardened. "I'm retiring next month, and I'm spending my retirement volunteering with the Nursing Alliance, teaching new nurses that they should be like you instead of like I was." The conversation was interrupted by Rachel Kim, the ICU charge nurse who'd quietly supported Tessa during the worst of the institutional warfare. She hugged Tessa with the fierce affection of someone who'd survived the same battle from a different position. "Half the original staff left after the verdict," Rachel said. "Couldn't handle the shame or didn't want to work somewhere rebuilding from scandal. But those of us who stayed, we're actually doing good work now. Real patient care without the political bullshit. I'm glad something good came from all this." "Something good?" "Tessa, you changed healthcare. Not just here, everywhere. Nurses across the country are citing your case when they report concerns. Medical boards are revising how they handle complaints. The whole hierarchy shifted because you refused to accept that your observations didn't matter." Tessa spent another hour at Northridge, walking through corridors that had once felt like a battlefield and now just felt like a hospital. She visited room 7, where Avery had waited in darkness, and found it occupied by a pediatric patient receiving excellent care from nurses who no longer looked afraid. She left through the main entrance, past the security desk where guards nodded respectfully, out into afternoon sunshine that felt like emerging from a tunnel. Torres walked beside her toward the parking garage, where Davies waited with the car. "How do you feel?" Torres asked. "Tired. Vindicated. Sad that it took all this to create basic accountability." Tessa paused. "But hopeful, maybe. That it actually mattered." "It mattered, trust me." They drove away from Northridge, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just another building in a city full of them. Tessa's phone buzzed with messages, speaking invitations, interview requests, policy consultations. Her calendar for the next 6 months was already filled with advocacy work, protocol development, testimony before medical boards implementing reforms. She'd never go back to bedside nursing, That part of her life was over, transformed by visibility into something she could never reclaim. But she was building something different, systems that would protect the nurses still at bedsides, still making critical observations, still choosing patients over politics. 1 year after the verdict, Tessa stood before the Senate Committee on Healthcare Oversight, testifying about the need for federal protections for medical professionals reporting patient safety concerns. The chamber was packed with media, advocacy groups, and institutional representatives who'd fought her every step. She'd practiced this testimony for weeks, refining language with Chen's team, coordinating with the Nursing Alliance, making sure every word carried maximum impact. But when the committee chairman asked her to explain why federal intervention was necessary, Tessa set aside her prepared remarks and spoke from memory that still carried trauma's weight. 1 year ago, I was a probationary nurse who found a treatable condition that specialists had missed. Reporting that observation should have been simple. Patient has symptom, nurse reports symptom, medical team investigates. Instead, it became a federal case involving witness intimidation, criminal prosecution, and institutional collapse. She detailed the threats, the retaliation, the coordinated campaign to discredit her. The senators listened with expressions ranging from sympathetic to skeptical, their responses predetermined by political affiliations and lobbying pressures. But here's what matters, Tessa continued. While my case got national attention, thousands of nurses face similar retaliation every year with no media coverage, no federal protection, no voice loud enough to matter. They see errors, report them through proper channels, and get fired or demoted or marginalized until they learn to stay quiet. She introduced documentation from the Nursing Alliance, case studies of nurses fired for reporting medication errors, demoted for questioning physician orders, blacklisted for testifying in malpractice cases. The scope was staggering, each case representing a moment where institutional self-preservation had mattered more than patient safety. Federal protection isn't about undermining medical authority, Tessa said, meeting each senator's eyes. It's about ensuring that authority comes from accuracy rather than hierarchy, that speaking up is rewarded instead of punished, that the next nurse who sees something wrong doesn't need to be as lucky as I was to survive telling the truth. The testimony lasted 4 hours, including questions from senators whose positions on healthcare reform ranged from supportive to openly hostile. One senator suggested that protecting nurses from retaliation would create chaos and undermine physician leadership. Tessa responded with data showing that hospitals with strong observation reporting systems had better patient outcomes and lower malpractice costs. Another senator asked if she thought her case was typical or an outlier that doesn't justify sweeping federal intervention. Tessa listed 20 similar cases from the past 18 months alone, each one involving nurses punished for reporting legitimate concerns. By the time the hearing concluded, she'd laid groundwork for legislation that might pass or might die in committee, depending on which lobbying group spent more money. But the testimony would be part of congressional record, citable in future cases, evidence that someone had stood before the federal government and demanded better. That evening, Tessa sat in a hotel room that no longer required federal protection, watching news coverage analyze her testimony with partisan predictability. Her phone rang. General Blackwood calling from wherever 4-star generals called from. "You know what you just did?" he asked. "Testified before Congress? You declared war on the entire medical establishment, and you did it with such precision they can't even identify how badly you just outmaneuvered them." Pride colored his voice. "Avery's watching the coverage with her mother. She wants you to know she's proud. We're all proud." I just told the truth. You weaponize truth against institutions that have spent centuries building defenses against it. That's not just anything. The call ended, and Tessa returned to watching coverage that painted her as either healthcare hero or dangerous radical, depending on the network. She'd stopped trying to control the narrative months ago, accepting that half the country would always see her as a troublemaker, while the other half saw her as exactly what the system needed. 18 months after the verdict, the federal legislation passed, not as strong as advocates wanted, not as comprehensive as patients deserved, but real protection nonetheless. The Patient Safety Observation Act created federal guidelines for how healthcare institutions must handle staff reports of potential safety concerns, with financial penalties for retaliation and whistleblower protections for employees who reported through proper channels. It wasn't perfect. Enforcement mechanisms were weak. Penalties were probably insufficient to deter large institutions, and dozens of loopholes existed for hospitals with expensive legal teams. But it was progress, tangible and documented, proof that speaking up could change systems even when those systems fought back with everything they had. Tessa attended the bill signing at the White House, standing among patient advocates and nursing leaders while the president delivered remarks about accountability and transparency. She shook hands with politicians who'd probably never set foot in a hospital ICU, smiled for photographs that would be used in campaign materials, and accepted congratulations from people who'd only supported the legislation once it became politically safe. But afterward, standing on the White House lawn while media photographed the advocates who'd made this happen, Tessa felt something close to peace. She'd started this journey as an invisible probationary nurse who just wanted to help one patient. Now she stood at the center of federal healthcare reform, her name attached to legislation that would protect countless nurses from the retaliation she'd survived. 2 years after the verdict, Tessa received a letter from Dr. Victor Crane. She almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won over caution. "Miss Morgan, I don't expect forgiveness or even acknowledgement of this letter. I'm writing because my therapist says I need to take accountability beyond legal proceedings, and you deserve to hear this directly. You were right. About the membrane, about my negligence, about the system protecting me instead of patients. I spent 20 years building a career on certainty, and when that certainty was challenged, I chose reputation over truth. 22 people paid for that choice with their sight. I've spent the last 2 years in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who could see a treatable condition and convince myself it wasn't there. The answer is banal and terrible. I prioritized being right over being accurate. I built an identity around never admitting mistakes, and that identity required me to keep making the same mistake rather than acknowledge the first one. You destroyed my career, and it was exactly what I deserved. But more importantly, you saved 22 people and created a system that might save thousands more. That matters more than any individual punishment. I don't know what I'll do with the rest of my life. My license is gone, my reputation is destroyed, and I'm legally barred from practicing medicine. But I've started volunteering with a patient advocacy group, helping them understand how institutional failures happen from the inside. If I can prevent one other doctor from making my mistakes, maybe that's worth something. You changed healthcare, Miss Morgan. I helped break it. That's the difference between us, and I'm learning to live with it. Victor Crane. Tessa read the letter 3 times, trying to find manipulation or self-pity hidden in the words. She found only exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. She couldn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give when the real victims were the 22 people he'd kept blind. But she could acknowledge that he was trying to build something from the ruins of what he'd destroyed. She didn't respond to the letter. Some conversations had no good conclusion, just the acceptance that harm couldn't be undone and the hope that future harm could be prevented. 3 years after the verdict, Tessa Morgan stood in front of 2,000 nursing students at a national conference, looking out at faces that carried the same mixture of idealism and exhaustion she'd brought to her first nursing job. They'd invited her to deliver the keynote address, and she'd spent weeks deciding what to tell young professionals entering a field that would simultaneously empower and exploit them. "I'm going to tell you something your professors probably haven't," Tessa began. "Healthcare is broken, deeply, systematically broken, and they're going to ask you to fix it by working harder, being more compassionate, accepting low pay and long hours because patients need you." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the inspirational message they'd expected. But here's what they won't tell you. You can't fix a broken system by being better victims of it. You fix it by refusing to accept that broken is normal, by speaking up when you see something wrong, by prioritizing patients over politics even when politics has all the power. Tessa's voice hardened. And by understanding that doing the right thing will probably cost you something. She walked them through her story, not the sanitized version that made headlines, but the real experience of being threatened, isolated, attacked for doing exactly what her training had taught her to do. "I lost my job, my apartment's security, my peace of mind. I gained federal protection, national recognition, and the knowledge that 22 people can see because I refused to stay quiet. Was it worth it?" Tessa paused, letting the question breathe. Ask those 22 people. Ask the nurses who've used my case to report concerns without being fired. Ask the patients who received better care because institutions knew they were being watched. She concluded with the only advice that felt honest. Be brave when bravery is required. Be strategic when strategy keeps you effective. And never, ever let anyone convince you that your observations don't matter just because you're not at the top of the hierarchy. Healthcare needs nurses who refuse to be invisible. Be those nurses. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, dozens of students approached with questions, concerns, and gratitude that their profession still had people willing to fight for it. One young woman, barely older than Avery had been, waited until everyone else had left. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "Terrified of doing what you did and losing everything. How do you find the courage?" Tessa thought about the question, really thought, searching for truth instead of platitude. "You don't find courage," she said finally. "You find something you care about more than your fear. For me, it was one patient who deserved better. Once I found that, courage became irrelevant. I was just doing what needed doing." What if I'm not that brave? Then be brave in smaller ways. Document everything. Report through proper channels. Build alliances with colleagues who share your values. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to refuse to be complicit. Tessa smiled slightly. And remember, they tried to destroy me for speaking up, and I'm still here, still working, still fighting. That's not because I'm special. It's because the system is changing, slowly, and people like us are changing it. The young nurse left with something that looked like determination, and Tessa felt the purpose she'd been building for 3 years solidify into certainty. She would never return to bedside nursing, but she could protect the nurses who did, could build systems that valued their observations, could ensure the next Tessa Morgan faced consequences for speaking up rather than silence for staying quiet. 5 years after the verdict, Tessa Morgan sat in her office at the National Nursing Alliance, reviewing applications for the scholarship program she'd helped establish. Full-ride funding for nursing students who committed to working in underserved communities and demonstrated willingness to prioritize patient advocacy over institutional politics. The scholarship was named after Sarah Kim, the 30-year-old victim who'd become the face of the medical fraud case before dying in a car accident 2 years after regaining her sight. Her death had been random tragedy rather than conspiracy, but it had reminded everyone involved that justice delayed was justice denied, that the years stolen by negligence couldn't be recovered, even when vision was restored. Tessa approved funding for 15 students who'd written passionate essays about changing healthcare from within, about refusing to accept broken systems as inevitable, about being the nurses patients deserved instead of the nurses institutions preferred. Each scholarship came with mentorship from nurses who'd survived retaliation for speaking up, creating networks of support that hadn't existed when Tessa had started her journey. Her phone rang. Avery Blackwood, now in her 2nd year of ophthalmology residency and already developing a reputation for actually listening to nursing observations during rounds. "I need your advice," Avery said without preamble. "One of our attendings is dismissing a nurse's concern about a patient's optic pressure. The nurse thinks she's seen early signs of acute glaucoma, but the attending says the numbers are borderline, and we should monitor instead of treating. What do you think?" "I think the nurse has been doing this for 20 years, and the attending graduated from medical school 18 months ago. But I'm just a resident, and speaking up means contradicting someone senior." Tessa smiled, hearing her own dilemma reflected from a different position. "What did I teach you? That patient safety matters more than hierarchy. That observations from experienced nurses deserve weight. That speaking up might cost you something, but silence costs patients more." Avery exhaled slowly. "I'm going to push for treatment, and if the attending refuses, I'm going to document my concerns and report through proper channels." "That's exactly right. And Avery, you're going to be the kind of doctor I wish I'd had when I started nursing. I'm going to be the kind of doctor you taught me to be." The call ended, and Tessa returned to scholarship applications, feeling the generational shift that was happening across healthcare. The nurses entering the field now had protections she'd helped build. The doctors being trained now were learning to value input from all care team members. The system was changing, glacially, with resistance at every turn, but changing nonetheless. She couldn't measure her impact in lives directly saved anymore, but she could measure it in policies implemented, protections established, students funded, and cultural shifts that made speaking up slightly less dangerous than it had been when she'd started. That evening, Tessa attended a gala for the Patient Safety Foundation, accepting yet another award for her advocacy work while surrounded by healthcare reformers, patient rights activists, and institutional leaders who'd learned the hard way that ignoring nursing observations was expensive. During her acceptance speech, Tessa looked out at an audience that included several of the 22 victims whose sight had been restored, nursing students who'd grown up watching her testimony, and journalists who'd covered the trial and its aftermath. When I examined Avery Blackwood 5 years ago, I didn't set out to change healthcare, Tessa said. I just refused to accept that a young woman's blindness was inevitable when everything I saw suggested it wasn't. That one decision cascaded into federal prosecution, institutional collapse, and systemic reform because the system was fragile enough that one person's refusal to stay quiet could crack its foundation. She paused, gathering the thought she'd been building toward for 5 years. But here's what matters. I wasn't special. I wasn't uniquely brave or particularly skilled. I was a probationary nurse who saw something wrong and refused to pretend I hadn't seen it. There are thousands of nurses making similar observations every day. The question isn't whether they see problems. It's whether we've built a system where seeing problems is rewarded instead of punished. Tessa held up the award, another piece of metal and glass to add to a collection that meant less than the actual work. This belongs to every nurse who's been told to stay in their lane, every patient who deserved better care than institutions provided, every person who chose truth over safety and paid for that choice with their career or their peace or their faith in systems that claim to protect them. She set down the award. We've made progress. We've built protections. We've changed culture. But the work isn't done until speaking up is the norm instead of the exception, until patient safety actually matters more than reputation, until no one needs to be as lucky as I was to survive doing the right thing. The applause was thunderous, but Tessa barely heard it. She was watching the audience, seeing nurses who'd found courage in her example, patients who'd received better care because institutions knew they were being watched, administrators who'd learned that accountability was cheaper than litigation. This was her legacy. Not one blind girl helped, but a system slightly less willing to blind people for profit. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was real, documented, codified into law and policy and practice. And it had started with one observation made by one nurse who refused to believe that staying invisible was worth more than helping one patient see. Later that night, alone in her apartment, a different apartment, in a different city, with better security and no threatening messages painted on walls, Tessa reviewed her calendar for the coming months. Congressional testimony about expanding patient safety protections, conference keynotes in 3 different states, policy consultations with hospitals implementing new reporting systems, media interviews about healthcare reform. She'd become what she'd never intended, a public figure, a symbol, a name synonymous with nursing advocacy and institutional accountability. It was exhausting, occasionally lonely, nothing like the quiet bedside care she'd originally chosen nursing to provide. But when her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Webb, the 10th victim, now finishing his memoir about gaining sight as an adult, she remembered why it mattered. Just got the publisher's final proofs. Chapter 7 is all about you. About what it meant to have someone look at me and see possibility instead of limitation. This book exists because you refuse to accept my blindness as permanent. Thank you for seeing me. Tessa set down her phone and looked out her window at a city full of hospitals, each one staffed by nurses making observations, reporting concerns, choosing between safety and honesty. Some of them would face retaliation, some would be supported, but all of them had slightly better protection than she'd had, slightly more chance that speaking up wouldn't destroy them. That was worth every threat, every attack, every moment of terror when the system had tried to make her disappear for refusing to stay invisible. She thought about the probationary nurse she'd been 5 years ago, uncertain, hopeful, believing competence would be enough to keep her safe. That version of herself had died in an ICU corridor when she'd chosen truth over self-preservation. What replaced her was harder, sharper, but infinitely more effective at changing systems than any amount of quiet competence could have been. Tessa Morgan had wanted to be a good nurse. Instead, she'd become something more dangerous and more necessary. A nurse who refused to be silenced, who took institutional corruption and transformed it into federal legislation, who turned her own near destruction into protection for thousands of others. The invisible nurse was gone. In her place stood someone visible enough to be targeted, credible enough to be believed, and powerful enough to ensure that the next person who saw something wrong wouldn't face what she'd faced alone. That was victory. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. And it was enough